My name is Harper. I am 31 years old, a corporate payroll specialist. And until last Sunday, I thought I had a normal marriage. My mother-in-law secretly got a DNA test done on my 3-year-old boy. At Sunday dinner, she slid an envelope across the table, smiling at my husband and telling him he should really look at it. He opened it and read every single line. Then he looked at his mother and then at me. What he said next made her face drop, and within seconds, she was begging him not to walk away. Before I tell you what those results actually revealed, please hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoy stories about karma catching up to toxic people. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to how this absolute nightmare started. We were sitting in the lavish, overwhelmingly massive dining room of my wealthy father-in-law, Richard. The crystal chandelier overhead cost more than my entire college education, and the custom mahogany table was set perfectly for Sunday dinner. For 5 brutal years, this dining room had served as my personal interrogation chamber. My mother-in-law, Barbara, made it her absolute life mission to treat me like a desperate gold-digging interloper who had somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. She despised my modest middle-class background, she sneered at my sensible work clothes, and she absolutely hated that I spent my days analyzing payroll data instead of attending her exclusive country club charity luncheons. The tension that evening was thick and suffocating. It always was whenever Barbara held court. The heavy silver cutlery clinked aggressively against the imported china, the sound echoing loudly in the stiff, uncomfortable silence. Richard sat at the head of the table, silently sipping his expensive red wine and completely ignoring his wife's sharp, calculating glares in my direction. I kept my eyes firmly focused on my plate, carefully slicing a piece of roast beef that I suddenly had absolutely no appetite for. My husband Liam sat right beside me, predictably quiet and avoiding eye contact. He always tried to keep the peace by pretending he simply did not notice his mother's relentless cruelty. But tonight pretending was not going to be an option. Barbara wiped the corners of her mouth with a pristine linen napkin and locked her cold, judgmental eyes directly onto mine. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy, exactly like the moment right before a severe thunderstorm breaks. She reached down beside her chair, her manicured fingers disappearing into her expensive designer purse. She did not say a single word at first. She just slowly pulled out a crisp white envelope and placed it firmly on the table. She pushed it toward Liam with a triumphant, malicious smile. The trap was set, and she was finally ready to watch my life burn to the ground. My husband Liam sat rigidly beside me. At 33 years old, he had perfected becoming entirely invisible in his own childhood home. He kept his gaze fixed on his half-empty water glass, refusing to look at the crisp white envelope his mother Barbara had placed on the mahogany table. He avoided conflict like a physical blow, hoping the storm would simply pass over him. Across from us was his older brother David, oblivious to the radioactive energy radiating from his mother. But beside David sat Jasmine. Jasmine was David's wife, an African-American corporate compliance officer who missed absolutely nothing. In a family that breathed passive aggression, Jasmine was my only true ally. Her sharp analytical mind was trained to detect fraud, and she applied that exact precision to Barbara's toxic behavior. Jasmine caught my eye, giving me a slow, knowing look that promised I was not alone. We had spent countless nights discussing Barbara's relentless campaign to push me out. The heavy silence stretched out, feeling thicker every second. Barbara let her manicured hand rest on the envelope, ensuring everyone felt the weight of her impending performance. Before revealing whatever crisis she had orchestrated inside, she decided to twist the knife regarding my domestic failures. Her eyes darted to the dessert buffet set up on the antique sideboard. I had picked up a berry tart from a local bakery. It sat in its cardboard box, completely out of place among the crystal dishes. Barbara let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, commanding the table's attention. She announced we would be having store-bought pastries again, her voice dripping with artificial pity. She said it was a shame because her husband Richard works hard all week, and a homemade meal is the least a wife can provide. She claimed serving a cardboard box at Sunday dinner was remarkably lazy on my part. I gripped my cloth napkin, pressing my fingernails into my palms. I desperately wanted to ask her how she expected me to bake a tart from scratch when I had barely slept in 3 days. Before I could force a word past the lump in my throat, Jasmine dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a deliberate clatter. The sound echoed through the dining room, cutting off Barbara's smug smirk. Jasmine spoke up, her voice carrying the calm, lethal authority she used to dismantle corrupt executives. She told Barbara that I do prioritize my household. Jasmine pointed out I prioritize it so much that I work 60-hour weeks as a corporate payroll specialist just to keep a roof over my family. Maintaining unblinking eye contact with our mother-in-law, Jasmine stated, everyone knew I had been single-handedly paying off the massive business debts Liam accumulated trying to launch his consulting firm. She reminded Barbara that I handle all of Liam's accounting late at night after a full shift at my actual job. Jasmine finished by saying everyone could survive the trauma of eating a store-bought dessert, especially since Barbara had not worked a single day in her adult life and contributed absolutely nothing besides a bitter attitude. The air practically crystallized. David coughed awkwardly into his napkin. I glanced at Liam, hoping he would finally validate my exhausting sacrifices and defend the woman who drained her savings to save him from bankruptcy. Instead, Liam just shifted uncomfortably, staring down at his plate and refusing to correct his mother. His silence was a crushing weight that emboldened Barbara week after week. Barbara's face flushed a deep, angry red. Hating being challenged by Jasmine, who wielded facts like a weapon, Barbara immediately pivoted to her most destructive tactic. Ignoring Jasmine entirely, she turned her icy gaze toward the corner of the dining room where my 3-year-old son Leo was quietly playing with his wooden blocks. Leo was the absolute center of my universe, a sweet, gentle boy who inherited my quiet nature. He looked up, feeling the sudden shift in energy, and offered his grandmother a hesitant, innocent smile. Barbara did not smile back. She stared intensely at his face, her eyes narrowing with calculated cruelty. Tilting her head, examining him like a defective product, she murmured that she looks at him and just cannot help but wonder. Her voice was deceptively soft, but carried across the silent room. She claimed it was truly fascinating how genetics work, pointing out that Liam has striking dark brown eyes, just like Richard and the family bloodline. Then she let her observation hang in the air, stating that little Leo has pale hazel eyes. She let the toxic implications seep into everyone's mind, repeating the words, hazel eyes slowly. She declared his eyes simply do not match the family bloodline at all, making a mother wonder exactly what hidden history is running through her grandson's veins. The accusation was absolute poison. She was openly implying I had been unfaithful and that the son I loved more than breathing did not belong to the man sitting beside me. The sheer audacity of her statement sent a rush of adrenaline straight through my veins, replacing my exhaustion with pure, blinding rage. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs as the suffocating tension in the room reached a boiling point. Jasmine stiffened in her chair, ready to unleash a firestorm. Liam finally looked up, completely bewildered by his mother's vicious attack on our child. But Barbara did not back down. Thriving on the chaos she created, her eyes gleamed with twisted satisfaction as she tapped her fingernails against the crisp white envelope sitting on the table. She had thoroughly laid the groundwork of doubt, questioning my loyalty, and publicly targeting my innocent child to set up her perfect psychological ambush. The walls of the dining room felt like they were rapidly closing in on us. Barbara let her hand rest lightly on the pristine white envelope. The harsh, glowing light of the enormous crystal chandelier reflected off her heavy diamond rings as she smoothed the paper with an agonizing, deliberate slowness. I sat frozen in my chair and watched her perfectly manicured fingers slide across the polished wood, pushing the envelope directly toward my husband. She did not look at me. She kept her cold, calculating gaze locked entirely on Liam. Her voice took on that sickeningly sweet theatrical tone she always used when she was about to say something unimaginably cruel. She told him that a mother always knows when something is deeply wrong in her family. She claimed she had been carrying a terrible, heavy burden for months, continuously worrying about the integrity of this household. I felt a freezing cold knot form rapidly in the pit of my stomach. I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about, but I knew with absolute certainty it was designed to utterly destroy me. Barbara leaned back gracefully in her expensive upholstered chair, crossing her arms with a triumphant, malicious smirk. She proudly announced to the silent room that during her brief babysitting visit last Tuesday, she had noticed my son Leo leave his juice box unattended on the kitchen counter. She actually boasted about waiting patiently until my back was completely turned so she could secretly slip the plastic straw into a sterile evidence bag she had purchased online. She told the entire table that she sent that stolen sample via overnight shipping to a premium genetic testing laboratory because she simply could not rest until she had irrefutable scientific proof of my deception. She sat there, radiating sheer, unadulterated arrogance, fully expecting me to break down, burst into tears, and confess to a horrific betrayal I never committed. The sheer invasive violation of it all made my blood run completely cold. She had physically stolen my 3-year-old son's genetic material from his own home. She treated my sweet, innocent baby like a piece of criminal evidence in her twisted, relentless crusade to rid her family of the working-class woman she deemed hopelessly unworthy. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to violently grab my child out of his corner play area and run far away from that massive, suffocating house forever. But my body remained completely paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her actions. I could only stare at the white envelope sitting ominously on the dark mahogany table, feeling the crushing gravity of her betrayal settle heavily over the room. The lavish dining room went absolutely dead silent. You could clearly hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the main hallway. No one dared to take a breath. David sat completely frozen beside his wife with his silver fork hovering halfway to his mouth. Richard sat at the head of the table staring intently at his wife with a deep, dark, unreadable expression shadowing his face. Then the suffocating silence finally shattered. Jasmine slammed both of her hands flat onto the table and pushed her heavy chair back violently. The thick carved wood scraped loudly and aggressively against the polished marble floor. As a seasoned corporate compliance officer, Jasmine dealt with strict legal boundaries and severe ethical violations every single day at her firm, and she was absolutely furious at what she was hearing. She pointed her finger directly at Barbara, her voice ringing out with absolute unyielding authority. She told Barbara that stealing a minor child's genetic material without proper parental consent was not just a massive personal boundary violation, but a deeply disturbed and potentially illegal act of aggression. She demanded loudly to know exactly what kind of sick grandmother secretly tests a toddler just to feed her own toxic paranoid delusions. Jasmine then quickly turned her sharp gaze to Liam, demanding he throw the envelope directly into the trash and fiercely defend his wife. She told him explicitly that indulging his mother's unhinged fantasy for even 1 second would cause permanent and irreparable damage to our marriage. I looked at Liam with a desperate, pleading gaze, hoping he would finally stand up and draw a firm, permanent line. I prayed he would sweep the envelope off the table into the garbage and tell his mother she had crossed a line she could never, ever uncross. Instead, Liam reached his arm out. His hand trembled slightly as his fingers brushed against the crisp white paper. He did not throw it away to protect me. He picked it up. He told Jasmine to wait, his voice shaking and barely above a strained whisper. He said we needed to end this exhausting conflict right now, once and for all. He wanted to officially clear the air so his mother would never ever question my loyalty again. Hearing those words felt like a jagged knife twisting violently in my chest. By choosing to open that envelope, he was quietly validating her absolute insanity. He was allowing her toxic seed of doubt to take a permanent root in our lives. Liam slid his shaking thumb under the tight seal of the envelope and tore it open. The sound of the ripping paper was incredibly loud and harsh in the suffocating quiet of the dining room. He pulled out several thick premium sheets of expensive lab paper, heavily branded with the testing facility's blue medical logo. I held my breath, forcing myself to remain completely still. I knew exactly what the results would say because I knew my own undeniable truth. I had never been with another man in my entire life. Leo was Liam's son, without a single shadow of a doubt. But the sheer utter humiliation of sitting there in front of my in-laws while my husband medically verified my faithfulness was absolutely agonizing to endure. I watched Liam's face closely analyzing every single micro-expression. I watched his dark eyes scan the dense, thick paragraphs of complicated medical jargon and advanced genetic data. At first, his expression was incredibly tight with suffocating dread. His broad shoulders were rigidly locked in place, and his jaw was clenched so incredibly hard, I genuinely thought his teeth might shatter under the pressure. As he reached the bottom of the first printed page, the extreme tension in his face suddenly morphed into profound, overwhelming confusion. his brow furrowed deeply, carving thick lines into his forehead. He quickly flipped over to the second page, reading much faster now, his eyes darting frantically back and forth across the printed text. He read it once completely, then immediately went back up to the very top of the page and read the entire dense section a second time. I clearly saw his breathing hitch in his throat. The deep confusion on his face rapidly dissolved into something entirely different and far more terrifying. It was a dark, simmering, white-hot rage. A thick blue vein pulsed visibly in the side of his neck. His large hands gripped the edges of the thick paper so incredibly tightly that his knuckles turned completely bone-white. The premium paper crinkled loudly under the sheer physical force of his intense grip. I braced myself tightly, waiting for him to finally look over at me and apologize profusely for entertaining his mother's wicked, destructive game. I waited patiently for him to eagerly show me the definitive proof of my complete innocence, but he did not look at me. He did not glance in my direction for even a single second. Instead, he slowly raised his heavy head and locked his furious, burning eyes directly onto his mother. The silence in the room stretched out thick, heavy, and incredibly dangerous. Barbara leaned forward eagerly in her plush chair, her expensive diamond necklace catching the overhead light, and her lips curled into a nasty, victorious sneer. She practically vibrated with joyful anticipation, fully expecting Liam to explode in anger and throw me out of the house right then and there. She asked him sweetly what the paper said, her tone dripping with heavy mock sympathy. She told him he needed to be incredibly strong tonight and accept the harsh truth about the terrible woman he had foolishly married. Liam suddenly slammed the heavy stack of papers down onto the solid mahogany table with terrifying explosive force. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled sharply and violently against the polished wood. He stared at her with the chilling look of absolute disgust and betrayal. He told her in a low, dangerously calm voice that Leo is undoubtedly his son. He stated clearly and firmly that the test definitively proves his biological paternity at 99.9%. He said I was entirely faithful and her disgusting, relentless accusations against me were nothing but pure wicked lies. Barbara's smug, victorious smile instantly vanished from her face. Her jaw went completely slack, and all the vibrant color drained rapidly from her perfectly powdered skin. She frantically stammered out a messy denial, violently shaking her head back and forth. She claimed loudly that the expensive lab must have made a terrible administrative mistake. She quickly reached her arm all the way across the wide table, trying desperately to grab the scattered papers, her manicured fingers clawing empty air. She insisted wildly there had to be a massive error with the bloodline matching process. Liam quickly snatched the documents away completely out of her desperate, frantic reach. He leaned his upper body across the table, instantly closing the physical distance between them. He told her there was absolutely no mistake whatsoever with the paternity testing, but there was a massive, undeniable anomaly in the extended family matching portion. His voice grew much louder, angrily echoing off the high, expensive ceilings of the lavish dining room. He explained forcefully that the premium service she used automatically ran the submitted sample against a massive global genetic database to map extensive family health histories. He said the system brightly flagged a primary relative genetic anomaly. Liam locked his furious, burning gaze directly onto his mother, completely ignoring the rest of us, sitting in stunned silence. He announced that his own DNA mapped perfectly to a biological half-uncle currently registered on the testing database. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath, letting the immense heavy weight of his exact words fill the silent room. Then he delivered the absolute fatal blow to her perfect life. He told her the biological half-uncle he matched with is definitely not Richard's brother. The horrifying realization hit the dining room like a massive explosive bomb detonating right in our laps. The genetic math was incredibly simple and undeniably devastating. If Liam had a biological uncle who was absolutely not related to Richard, then Liam was not Richard's biological son. Barbara had spent 5 entire years aggressively projecting her own wicked deceptions directly onto me. She had viciously scrutinized my loyalty while actively hiding an unforgivable world-shattering secret of her very own. Her desperate, malicious attempt to publicly expose me using a stolen juice box had just violently blown the lid off her own 33-year-old hidden infidelity. The magnificent, powerful patriarch of the family sat completely frozen at the head of the table. Richard stared blankly at his wife, his expression rapidly transforming from stoic, controlled silence to pure, unfiltered, horrific shock. Barbara gasped loudly for air, looking exactly like a desperate fish thrown roughly onto dry land. Her perfect, untouchable, wealthy empire was completely collapsing around her in real time. She had willfully handed her son the exact weapon needed to destroy her entirely, and she had proudly done it with a cruel smile on her face. The absolute silence in the dining room was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air right out of my lungs. For 5 long, agonizing years, I had watched Barbara move through this massive house with the untouchable grace of a queen. She was a woman who commanded every room she walked into a woman who used her wealth and status as a weapon to make everyone around her feel incredibly small. But in that single, horrifying second, her entire pristine facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The smug, arrogant sneer she had worn just moments ago physically melted off her face. Her perfectly manicured hands began to shake so violently that her heavy diamond rings clicked loudly against the polished mahogany table. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, strangled gasp came out. She looked at Liam with wide, terrified eyes, her carefully powdered skin turning a sickly shade of ash grey. Then the genuine panic set in. It was not a calculated display of emotion. It was the raw, desperate terror of a woman realizing her absolute worst nightmare had just been laid bare for everyone to see. She lunged forward across the table, her arms flailing wildly as she tried to snatch the testing documents back from her son. She knocked over a crystal wine glass, sending dark red wine spilling across the expensive white linen tablecloth like a pool of fresh blood. She did not even notice the mess. She just kept aggressively clawing at the air, desperately trying to retrieve the evidence of her 33-year-old betrayal. Liam easily held the papers out of her reach, his jaw locked in pure, unadulterated disgust. When she realized she could not get the documents back, she completely broke down. The composed, elegant matriarch of the family devolved into a sobbing, hyperventilating mess right before our very eyes. She collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest and gasping loudly for air. Tears ruined her expensive makeup, leaving dark black streaks running down her pale cheeks. She looked frantically toward the head of the table, her voice trembling and cracking as she began to beg. She pleaded with her husband, telling him it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a horrible scientific error that could easily be explained. She begged him not to look at the papers, swearing on her life that the testing facility had mixed up the samples. Her desperation was thick and suffocating, but it only made her guilt glaringly obvious to everyone sitting in that room. Richard had not moved a single muscle since Liam spoke those devastating words. As a high-powered commercial real estate developer, Richard was a man who built towering skyscrapers and ruthlessly crushed his competition. He was entirely accustomed to wielding absolute power. He managed multi-million-dollar negotiations without breaking a sweat, and he ruled his family with the same cold, calculating authority. I had always been genuinely terrified of him. He never yelled, he never had to. His silence was always far more intimidating than any raised voice. And right now, his silence was absolutely deafening. He sat at the head of the table, his dark eyes completely unreadable as he watched his wife unravel into a weeping, hysterical state. He slowly, carefully placed his linen napkin on the table beside his plate. The deliberate calmness of his movement sent a sharp, chilling shiver straight down my spine. He did not look at me. He did not look at Liam or Jasmine or David. He kept his steely gaze locked entirely on Barbara. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, and completely devoid of any recognizable emotion. He extended his right hand toward Liam, his palm facing upward, and demanded the envelope. He did not raise his voice or issue a threat. He simply gave an order, expecting immediate total compliance. Barbara let out a sharp, terrified shriek. She threw herself out of her chair, scrambling clumsily around the large table and practically falling to her knees beside her husband. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging frantically into the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging him to just listen to her, claiming the test was a malicious lie designed to tear their beautiful family apart. She swore she had been entirely faithful for 40 years, pleading with him to simply throw the papers into the fireplace and forget this entire horrific night ever happened. Richard did not even flinch. He did not comfort her. He did not pull away. He simply turned his head and stared down at the desperate, weeping woman clinging to his arm. He looked at her, not with anger, but with the clinical, detached disgust of a man evaluating a worthless, discarded object. He calmly instructed her to take her hands off him. The sheer freezing temperature of his tone made Barbara physically recoil. She slowly let go of his sleeve, shrinking back like she had been physically burned. Richard extended his hand toward Liam once more. Liam, still breathing heavily and vibrating with furious anger, handed the thick stack of premium lab papers over to the man who had raised him. The entire room held its breath as Richard carefully adjusted his reading glasses. He took his time, deliberately smoothing out the crinkled pages that Liam had gripped so tightly. He read the first page entirely, ignoring the loud, desperate sobs coming from his wife. He read the second page, tracing his index finger slowly down the complex columns of genetic data and familial matching percentages. For a long, terrifying minute, the only sound in the massive dining room was the quiet rear rustling of paper and Barbara's frantic, shallow breathing. Then Richard reached the final page, the extended family analysis. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his gaze stop abruptly on a specific line of information. I saw his broad shoulders stiffen instantly. The slight tightening of his jaw was the only physical indication that the bullet had found its mark. The genetic testing database had not just flagged an anonymous Huff uncle, it had provided a distinct geographic location and a specific surname matching a prominent business family in the region. Jasmine, who was sitting perfectly still across from me, suddenly sucked in a sharp breath, realizing exactly what Richard was reading. The familial match pointed directly to a man named Marcus Sterling. Marcus Sterling was not just a random stranger. He was Richard's former business partner and his absolute most bitter rival. 20 years ago, Marcus and Richard had engaged in a vicious, highly publicized corporate war over a prime downtown commercial development. Marcus had tried to ruthlessly bankrupt Richard using underhanded tactics and deceit. Richard had eventually won the bitter feud, driving Marcus out of the state entirely. But the deep personal hatred between the two men was legendary in our city's real estate circles. Now sitting at his own dining room table, Richard was looking at irrefutable scientific proof that his arrogant, vindictive wife had not only betrayed their marriage vows, but she had slept with his absolute worst enemy. The ultimate, unspeakable humiliation. The man Richard despised more than anyone else on earth was the biological father of the son Richard had raised, funded, and groomed to inherit his massive empire. The profound, sickening irony of the situation hung heavily in the air. Barbara had spent her entire evening trying to publicly expose me as a common cheating fraud just to protect her precious family bloodline. Instead, she had handed her powerful husband the documented proof of her own spectacular, unforgivable treachery. She had willingly paid a premium laboratory to completely destroy her entire life. Richard slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them neatly beside his plate. He neatly folded the lab documents and tucked them securely into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He did not scream. He did not throw his wine glass against the wall or flip the heavy mahogany table. He possessed the terrifying, dangerous calm of a predator preparing to strike. He slowly turned his head to look down at Barbara, who was currently huddled on the expensive Persian rug, weeping uncontrollably into her trembling hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was so incredibly cold, it felt like the temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees. He told her she had exactly 15 minutes to pack a single suitcase. He instructed her to walk up the stairs, put whatever personal items she could fit into one bag, and walk out the front door. He specifically commanded her to leave her keys, her credit cards, and her jewelry on the entryway table. He told her if she was not completely off his property in 15 minutes, he would personally drag her out by her hair and call the police to report a trespasser. Barbara gasped, staring up at him with wide, horrified eyes. She tried to protest, crying out that this was her home, her house, her family. She begged him to think of their public reputation, their social standing, their decades of marriage. Richard leaned down slightly, his dark eyes boring directly into hers with pure, absolute hatred. He stated clearly that she no longer had a home, a husband, or a reputation. He told her she was absolutely nothing to him anymore. He firmly ordered her to get out of his sight before he lost what little remained of his temper. Barbara looked frantically around the room, searching desperately for an ally. She looked at David, who was staring at his plate in utter shock. She looked at Jasmine, who met her gaze with cold, unyielding satisfaction. She looked at Liam, the son she had used as a pawn in her wicked game, who turned his face away from her in absolute disgust. Finally, she looked at me. I sat tall in my chair, refusing to look away, holding her gaze with steady, unwavering strength. She had tried to destroy me tonight, but she had only managed to annihilate herself. Realizing she was completely, entirely alone, Barbara slowly pulled herself up from the floor. She let out one final pathetic sob before turning and stumbling awkwardly out of the dining room, her expensive heels clicking unevenly against the marble floor. We sat in the heavy silence, listening to her hurried, desperate footsteps echoing up the grand staircase. The wicked, tyrannical queen of the family had just been forcefully dethroned, and the sheer intoxicating relief of her departure was absolutely overwhelming. We walked out of the massive oak front doors of the mansion, and the freezing night air hit my face like a physical blow. The heavy silence of the long sweeping driveway was a stark, haunting contrast to the absolute destruction we had just left behind in the dining room. I held Leo tightly against my chest, feeling his steady little heartbeat drumming against mine. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his innocent, discarded juice box had just detonated a 33-year-old lie. Liam walked beside me like a ghost. His broad shoulders were slumped, his steps were jarringly uneven, and his dark eyes were fixed blindly on the concrete pavement. He unlocked our car without uttering a single word. I carefully strapped Leo into his secure car seat in the back, smoothing his soft hair and kissing his warm forehead before gently closing the door. When I finally slid into the passenger seat, the suffocating tension inside the small enclosed space of our vehicle was immediately overwhelming. Liam did not start the engine right away. He just sat there, gripping the leather steering wheel and staring blankly through the windshield at the imposing brick facade of the only childhood home he had ever known. The beautiful, lavish home he now knew he had absolutely no biological right to claim. Finally, he turned the key and put the car into drive. We rolled slowly down the long, winding driveway, past the perfectly manicured hedges and the towering wrought iron security gates. The heavy metal doors clicked shut behind us, echoing in the dark night with a profound, terrifying finality. We drove through the quiet, empty streets of the upscale neighborhood in absolute total silence. The rhythmic flashing of the passing streetlights cast long, harsh shadows across Liam's pale face, highlighting the raw, unfiltered agony permanently etched into every single feature. His entire identity had just been violently obliterated in a matter of seconds. Everything he firmly believed about himself, about his powerful father, about his rightful place in the world, was a meticulously crafted lie, spun by the very woman who gave birth to him. I watched his large hands gripping the steering wheel so incredibly tightly that his knuckles were stark bone white. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, fighting a losing brutal battle against a total psychological panic attack. 10 minutes into the agonizing drive, Liam abruptly jerked the steering wheel to the right and pulled the car roughly into the empty parking lot of a closed suburban strip mall. He violently slammed the gearshift into park and unbuckled his seatbelt with shaking, frantic hands. Then the emotional dam completely broke. He buried his face deep into his hands and let out a raw, agonizing sob that seemed to tear straight up from his very soul. It was the horrific sound of a grown man mourning the sudden violent death of his own reality. I immediately reached across the center console and wrapped my arms tightly around his shaking shoulders, holding him fiercely as the immense crushing weight of his mother's betrayal finally collapsed directly on top of him. He cried until he physically could not catch his breath, his large frame trembling uncontrollably in the dark, silent car. When the heavy, devastating sobs finally began to subside, Liam leaned his head back against the leather headrest, staring blankly at the dark ceiling of the car. His voice was incredibly hoarse and broken as the dark, suffocating memories began to pour out of him. He told me about the crushing, immense pressure he had endured every single day of his miserable childhood. He talked about how Barbara had relentlessly driven him to emulate Richard in absolutely everything he did. She had forcefully pushed him into cutthroat business programs he absolutely hated, demanding he secure top grades and prestigious corporate internships just to prove he was a worthy and capable heir. He vividly remembered how she would stand over his desk while he studied late into the night, whispering constantly that he had to be completely flawless to secure his rightful place in the family empire. She made him rigidly adopt Richard's aggressive mannerisms, Richard's expensive tailored tastes, and even Richard's exact golf swing. She explicitly drilled into his head that Richard demanded absolute perfection from his bloodline, and that Liam could not afford to make a single noticeable mistake. Liam turned his red-rimmed eyes toward me, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of profound sorrow and rapidly rising anger. He reminded me of the relentless, vicious cruelty Barbara had aggressively subjected me to since the very first day we met. He recounted how she constantly and publicly berated me for not having the right social pedigree. She had practically spit on my modest working-class upbringing, telling Liam constantly that a man of his high standing desperately needed a woman with flawless, wealthy genetics. She had intentionally humiliated me at countless family functions, loudly mocking my perfectly sensible clothes and my steady, reliable job as a corporate payroll specialist. She proudly claimed my common background would permanently dilute the prestigious family brand. But as Liam spoke those painful memories aloud, the horrific, sickening truth suddenly crystallized in both of our minds with absolute terrifying clarity. Barbara was never actually obsessed with protecting Richard's pure aristocratic bloodline. She was absolutely terrified of her own dirty, treacherous secret. She ruthlessly attacked my background to intentionally deflect any possible scrutiny away from her own fraudulent existence. She aggressively projected her own massive suffocating guilt and her own impure actions directly onto me. I had unknowingly served as the perfect, convenient scapegoat for a desperate woman hiding a catastrophic 33-year-old betrayal. She called me a fraud because she was the ultimate fraud. She scrutinized my loyalty because she possessed absolutely none. Liam forcefully hit the steering wheel with the flat palm of his hand, his righteous anger finally overriding his paralyzing shock. He detailed how she had aggressively pushed him to take out massive risky business loans to launch his logistics consulting firm, strictly insisting that Richard only respected men who took massive aggressive financial risks. When his business inevitably struggled, and I was forced to work brutal 60-hour weeks just to keep us entirely out of bankruptcy, Barbara had simply smirked and told everyone it was my basic duty to support my betters. She happily watched me drain my entire life savings account and sacrifice my physical health to firmly protect the pristine, successful image she demanded Liam project to the wealthy world. She maliciously used us both. She used his desperate childhood need for his father's approval to completely control him, and she actively used my unwavering dedication to my husband to quietly fund her perfect little illusion. Everything she did, every cruel word she spoke, every financial demand she made was carefully designed to keep everyone completely off balance, so no one would ever dare look too closely at the glaring catastrophic inconsistencies in her own life. We sat there together in the quiet car, letting the heavy realizations settle over us like a thick, suffocating blanket. The elegant, wealthy woman we had both bent over backward to please for years was nothing but a manipulative, calculating predator. She had viciously stolen Liam's true history, and she had selfishly stolen years of our peace and financial stability. But the profound sadness in Liam's eyes was slowly hardening into cold, sharp steel. The pristine illusion of his perfect mother was officially dead, and the man sitting next to me was finally beginning to see the world clearly for the first time in his entire life. He reached out and tightly grabbed my hand, his thumb gently stroking my knuckles. He whispered a quiet, raspy apology for never standing up to her sooner, for letting her treat me like disposable trash, and for blindly trusting a woman who was actively destroying us both. I squeezed his hand back firmly, telling him the only thing that mattered now was that we finally knew the absolute truth, and we were officially completely free from her toxic, twisted grip. Just as a fragile sense of calm began to settle over the damp interior of the car, the sharp, loud ping of Liam's cell phone violently shattered the quiet moment. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin, casting a harsh blue light across Liam's face. He picked up the phone from the center cup holder, his brow furrowing deeply as he read the notification banner. It was an urgent text message from Barbara. After the spectacular world-shattering destruction she had just caused at the dinner table, I genuinely expected a long, frantic paragraph filled with desperate apologies and weeping pleas for forgiveness. I fully expected the panicked, heartbroken words of a mother who realized she had just completely lost her only son. But as Liam opened the message and his eyes rapidly scanned the glowing text, his jaw locked so hard, the muscles visibly jumped under his pale skin. He did not say a single word to me. He just slowly handed the phone across the console, his eyes burning with a terrifying, icy disgust. I took the phone and looked down at the bright screen. The message was incredibly short and aggressively frantic, but there was absolutely no apology to be found anywhere. There was no mention of the massive psychological trauma she had just inflicted on him. There was zero remorse for the 33 years of horrific deception. Instead, her words were entirely consumed by pure, unadulterated greed. The text read that Liam had to help her right this exact second. She typed that Richard had just kicked her out of the mansion and she knew he was calling his vicious corporate lawyers to permanently block her bank access. She demanded that Liam log into the joint family trust portal immediately and authorize a massive transfer to her private offshore account before Richard officially froze the assets. She commanded him to do this for his mother quickly before it was too late. I stared at the glowing words, feeling a cold, nauseating sickness wash completely over my entire body. She had just been brutally exposed for carrying out one of the most deceitful, disgusting betrayals imaginable. She had just watched her wealthy husband's heart break and her son's entire reality shatter into a million jagged pieces. And her only immediate concern was securing the stolen wealth she still felt entirely entitled to. She wanted Liam, the son she had blatantly lied to for his entire existence, to actively help her steal millions from the only father he had ever known. Her insatiable greed completely eclipsed any microscopic shred of maternal guilt she might have possessed. She did not care about the catastrophic emotional damage she had caused our family tonight. She only cared about her hidden offshore accounts and preserving her stolen luxury lifestyle. I slowly handed the phone back to Liam. The devastated, weeping boy from 20 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place sat a hardened, resolute man who finally understood exactly what kind of ruthless monster we were dealing with. He locked his phone screen and tossed the device carelessly into the back seat. He looked at me with a cold, deadly determination that sent a sudden, thrilling rush of adrenaline straight through my veins. Barbara genuinely thought she could continue to easily manipulate him using the sacred title of mother as a weapon to magically secure her financial escape. But she had vastly underestimated the absolute fury of a son deeply scorned, and she had completely forgotten that she was dealing with a corporate payroll specialist who knew exactly how to track every single dirty cent. The sad mourning period was officially over. It was time for us to finally go on the offensive. The morning sun crawled slowly through the large living room windows, painting harsh, bright lines across the dark hardwood floor. It felt entirely wrong for the beautiful day outside to look so perfectly normal after the catastrophic destruction we had just witnessed the night before. Liam sat completely motionless on the edge of the grey sofa, staring blankly at the cold cup of black coffee I had carefully placed in his trembling hands over 2 hours earlier. He had not slept a single minute. The devastating, crushing weight of his mother's 33-year-old betrayal had effectively paralyzed him physically and emotionally. His smartphone sat on the glass coffee table face down, a silent, glowing reminder of the frantic, greedy text message Barbara had sent, demanding he help her steal from the family trust fund. I watched my husband quietly, my heart deeply aching for the tremendous pain he was actively enduring, but my mind was already racing with a cold, sharp clarity. The front doorbell rang suddenly and violently, shattering the heavy, suffocating silence of the quiet house. I walked quickly to the tiled entryway, half expecting to find Richard, or perhaps even Barbara, attempting to force her way inside to continue her reign of terror. Instead, I opened the heavy wooden door to find Jasmine standing firmly on the porch, holding a thick leather briefcase and wearing an expression of absolute lethal determination. Jasmine did not bother with any polite pleasantries. She did not ask how we were holding up or offer any useless sympathetic platitudes about family trauma. As a senior corporate compliance officer, she was professionally trained to completely bypass the emotional wreckage of a crisis and focus entirely on the cold, hard, actionable facts. She walked right past me, stepping quickly out of her sleek black trench coat and marching directly into the living room. She took one quick evaluating look at Liam sitting frozen and unresponsive on the couch, and then turned her sharp, calculating gaze completely onto me. She told me to grab my work laptop and follow her right into the dining room because we had an incredible amount of investigative work to do immediately. I hesitated for a split second, glancing back at Liam, but he gently squeezed my hand and nodded silently, giving me full permission to leave him alone to process his thoughts. I grabbed my silver computer and sat down across from Jasmine at our small wooden kitchen table. She forcefully snapped the brass latches of her briefcase open, pulling out a perfectly organized yellow legal pad and a heavy silver pen. She leaned forward, her dark, intelligent eyes locking intensely onto mine, and she told me exactly why she was sitting in my house at 8 in the morning. Jasmine said that in her intense line of work, tracking white-collar crime, whenever someone discovers a massive foundational lie, there is always a secondary financial motive buried right beneath the surface. She stated clearly and firmly that if Barbara was bold enough and arrogant enough to actively hide a secret biological child for over 3 decades right under Richard's nose, she was undoubtedly hiding a massive mountain of his liquid assets too. She reminded me of the frantic late-night text message Barbara had sent Liam, desperately demanding immediate access to the joint family trust account before Richard could legally freeze it. Jasmine pointed out that a woman whose entire world had just spectacularly collapsed should be weeping on the floor begging for forgiveness, not coldly orchestrating a rapid wire transfer to a private offshore account. The profound, disgusting greed displayed in that single text message completely confirmed Jasmine's professional suspicions. Barbara was actively attempting a fast, desperate financial escape, and she was maliciously using the very son she had lied to as her unwitting getaway driver. Jasmine tapped her silver pen rhythmically against the wooden table, explaining that Richard was currently locked in emergency weekend meetings with his aggressive, high-priced divorce attorneys. He was completely blinded by his own masculine rage and profound personal humiliation. He was entirely focused on legally destroying his unfaithful wife, but he was absolutely not looking at the hidden structural integrity of his own real estate empire. Jasmine looked at me with an intense, fierce loyalty that I had desperately craved since the very first day I married into this deeply toxic aristocratic family. She said that while the wealthy men were currently paralyzed by their own grief and explosive anger, it was entirely up to us to quietly follow the money. She laid out a flawless, brilliant investigative strategy right there at my kitchen table. As a top-tier corporate compliance officer, Jasmine possessed high-level administrative access to federal financial tracking databases, public business registries, and complex legal search tools. She knew exactly how to find hidden shell companies and unmask anonymous corporate officers operating in the shadows. But she also knew that locating the corporate entities was only half the battle. We desperately needed someone who intimately understood the daily granular movement of corporate money. We needed someone who could spot fake invoices, irregular vendor payments, and cleverly manipulated balance sheets. Jasmine smiled a sharp, dangerous smile and reminded me that I was a highly skilled payroll specialist and an exceptional corporate accountant. I spent 40 hours a week auditing messy spreadsheets, catching tiny numerical discrepancies, and keeping aggressive corporate executives completely honest. She told me that my specific analytical skill set was exactly the lethal weapon we needed to completely dismantle Barbara's hidden financial web. I felt a sudden powerful surge of adrenaline rush completely through my veins, instantly wiping away the exhausting physical fatigue of the sleepless night. For 5 agonizing years, Barbara had relentlessly mocked my sensible profession, calling me a common low-level numbers girl who brought absolutely zero value to her prestigious high society family. She had viciously belittled my career at every single holiday dinner, making me feel incredibly small and hopelessly inadequate. But now that very same career was going to be the exact instrument of her total, absolute ruin. I opened my laptop, the bright screen illuminating my determined face, and I quickly pulled up the internal accounting software I used to manage Liam's business. Liam had previously linked his corporate accounts to Richard's primary real estate holding company to secure better commercial credit rates from the bank. That simple administrative connection gave me a tiny, almost invisible backdoor directly into the massive financial architecture of Richard's entire real estate empire. Jasmine and I formed a quiet, unbreakable pact right there in the bright morning light. We were going to methodically track down every single dollar Barbara had ever touched. We began crossing our vast, distinct fields of expertise to build an impenetrable concrete wall of evidence. I started running complex sorting algorithms, pulling thousands of vendor payments, employee payroll records, and corporate expense reports from the last 10 years of Richard's business history. Jasmine simultaneously cross-referenced the suspicious payee names through her secure legal databases, hunting for unregistered limited liability companies and questionable offshore tax havens. The sheer volume of raw data flooding my screen was incredibly overwhelming, but we moved with a terrifying silent synergy. Every time I spotted an irregular monthly wire transfer, vaguely categorized as a miscellaneous consulting fee, Jasmine immediately ran the corresponding routing numbers to see exactly where the stolen money eventually landed. We were two highly intelligent, deeply underestimated women, meticulously tearing apart the dark financial secrets of a woman who arrogantly thought she was entirely untouchable. As the hours slowly ticked by, the black coffee in our ceramic mugs went completely cold, but neither of us dared to stop looking. The numbers glowing on the computer screen were rapidly beginning to tell a horrific, terrifying story of long-term systemic theft. I noticed a distinct recurring pattern of large identical payments being quietly siphoned out of Richard's massive commercial maintenance budgets. These massive payments were always manually authorized by Barbara's personal signature stamp, and they were always routed directly to a vaguely named property management firm located in southern Florida. I pointed eagerly at the screen, my finger tracing the long list of fraudulent bank transactions. I told Jasmine that Barbara had been approving $50,000 invoices every single month for commercial landscaping services on downtown concrete properties that did not even have a single blade of grass. Jasmine immediately typed the name of the Florida management firm into her secure federal compliance registry. Her sharp, dark eyes widened in absolute shock as the official corporate registration documents populated on her screen. The intense tension in the kitchen instantly skyrocketed to dangerous boiling point. The invisible protective wall surrounding Barbara's perfect wealthy life was rapidly starting to violently crack right before our eyes. We had just uncovered the very tip of a massive illegal iceberg, and the sheer scale of the financial deception was truly breathtaking. Barbara had not just committed 33 years of emotional marital infidelity. She had been actively orchestrating a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme right under the noses of some of the most powerful, aggressive businessmen in the entire city. Jasmine looked across the wooden table at me, her expression hardening into pure, cold, unbreakable steel. The simple, dramatic family conflict had just violently escalated into a massive federal crime. A new, incredibly dangerous war had officially begun, and we were the only ones who currently held the actual map to the buried treasure. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than it had ever been. Jasmine and I sat across from each other, the harsh blue light of our laptops illuminating our determined faces. We had just uncovered a massive financial irregularity pointing directly to a phantom property management firm in Florida. But tracing the money was only half the puzzle. We desperately needed to fully understand the man behind the curtain. We needed to unmask Marcus Sterling. I pulled up the initial DNA results Liam had left on the kitchen counter. Marcus Sterling. The name itself felt like a heavy anchor. Richard's absolute most bitter rival, the man who had aggressively tried to bankrupt him 20 years ago. The profound, sickening reality that this specific man was Liam's biological father was almost too twisted to comprehend. It was not just a random affair. It was a calculated, catastrophic betrayal involving Richard's sworn enemy. Jasmine, with her high-level compliance access, immediately began running deep background checks on Marcus Sterling. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up public records, old news articles, and archived court documents. Marcus had been a prominent, aggressive player in the Seattle commercial real estate market during the late 90s. He was known for his ruthless tactics and his flashy, arrogant lifestyle. He and Richard had fiercely competed for several highly lucrative downtown development projects. Their rivalry was intensely public and deeply personal. But 20 years ago, right around the time Liam was born, Marcus Sterling's massive real estate empire suddenly spectacularly collapsed. He filed for bankruptcy, claiming a series of catastrophic bad investments and shifting market conditions had completely wiped out his entire portfolio. He essentially vanished from the Seattle business scene, leaving behind a trail of angry creditors and unpaid contractors. The official narrative was that he had lost absolutely everything and retreated into obscure poverty. Jasmine frowned deeply, her dark eyes scanning the complex financial history glowing on her screen. She pointed out that bankrupt men do not simply vanish into thin air without leaving some kind of a trace. She started pulling property records and vehicle registrations under his name and known aliases. The official bankruptcy filings painted a picture of absolute financial ruin, but the subsequent records told a completely different, entirely shocking story. Marcus Sterling had relocated to Miami, Florida, shortly after his highly publicized bankruptcy. And despite officially claiming to have zero personal assets, he was currently listed as the primary resident of a luxurious $5 million waterfront estate in a highly exclusive gated community. He drove a late-model Porsche and held premium memberships at 3 different high-end country clubs. He was living the extravagant, lavish lifestyle of a multimillionaire while officially reporting almost no taxable income. I stared at the screen, a cold realization slowly creeping up my spine. How does a disgraced, completely bankrupt real estate developer miraculously maintain a $5 million estate and a fleet of luxury cars? The answer was sitting right in front of us, glowing on my laptop screen. The massive, fraudulent monthly payments Barbara had been quietly authorizing from Richard's corporate accounts. The $50,000 invoices routed to the fake property management firm in Florida. Jasmine and I simultaneously looked at each other, the horrifying truth fully crystallizing in our minds. Barbara was not just hiding a secret biological child. She was actively fully funding her former lover's lavish lifestyle using her husband's stolen money. She had been quietly, systematically draining Richard's massive real estate empire to support the very man who had aggressively tried to destroy him 20 years ago. It was an absolutely staggering level of deception. I quickly pulled up the corporate structure of the fake Florida property management firm. It was heavily layered behind 3 different anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, making it incredibly difficult to trace the ultimate beneficiary. But Jasmine, using her advanced compliance software, managed to pierce the corporate veil. The primary registered agent for the final shell company was a man named David Sterling, Marcus Sterling's younger brother. The massive financial puzzle pieces were rapidly, violently locking into place. Barbara had established a sophisticated, highly secure pipeline to funnel millions of dollars directly to Marcus, completely bypassing any standard financial scrutiny. She had used her unchecked administrative access to Richard's accounts to orchestrate a massive ongoing theft right under his nose. And she had done it all while aggressively lecturing me about family loyalty and protecting the precious family bloodline. But there was still one massive glaring question that desperately needed answering. How had Barbara managed to maintain this incredibly risky long-distance affair for over 3 decades without raising any suspicion? Richard was a highly controlling, demanding man who expected to know his wife's exact whereabouts at all times. How did she possibly explain her frequent trips to Florida without him noticing? I logged into the shared family calendar software. Barbara had always insisted on meticulously tracking every single family event, vacation, and social obligation in a central digital calendar. She claimed it was necessary to maintain order and proper social etiquette. I started rapidly scrolling backward through the years, focusing intensely on her scheduled solo trips and personal commitments. Barbara was heavily involved in several prominent high society charity committees. She frequently traveled across the country, attending exclusive galas, fundraising seminars, and national board meetings. She always made a massive dramatic show of complaining about how exhausting her charitable obligations were, loudly sighing about the heavy burden of philanthropy at every Sunday dinner. I began cross-referencing the dates of her charity trips with the locations of the national conferences she claimed to be attending. A distinct chilling pattern immediately emerged. Almost every single one of her major out-of-state charity commitments magically aligned with a specific geographic area: Miami, Florida. In 2018, she claimed to be attending a week-long pediatric cancer fundraising summit in Orlando. The actual conference was held in Chicago. In 2021, she told Richard she was incredibly honored to be invited to a prestigious environmental gala in Palm Beach. The gala did not even exist. For the past decade, Barbara had been methodically using her fake charitable obligations as the perfect airtight cover story to secretly travel to Florida and maintain her affair with Marcus Sterling. She had built a flawless, impenetrable facade. To the outside world, she was a devoted, aristocratic wife and a tireless, generous philanthropist. To Richard, she was the perfect high society partner, managing his social calendar and raising his heir. But the absolute horrifying truth was that she was a deeply deceptive, calculating thief who had spent her entire adult life playing a massive, dangerous game. I leaned back in my chair, the sheer weight of the discoveries pressing heavily against my chest. We had just completely unraveled a 33-year-old conspiracy. We had definitive, irrefutable proof of her massive financial embezzlement, her ongoing affair, and the shocking true identity of Liam's biological father. The incredibly arrogant woman who had maliciously tried to destroy my life with a stolen juice box had carelessly left behind a massive blazing trail of digital evidence. Jasmine let out a low, sharp whistle, shaking her head in pure, unadulterated disbelief. She stated firmly that Barbara was not just a toxic, cruel mother-in-law. She was a highly sophisticated, remorseless criminal who had systematically stolen millions from her own family. Jasmine warned me that dealing with someone this deeply entrenched in their own lies was incredibly dangerous. Barbara had absolutely everything to lose, and she would undoubtedly fight like a cornered, vicious animal to protect her stolen wealth and her fragile, pristine reputation. I looked at the glowing laptop screens filled with the damning financial records and the fake charity itineraries. The intense white-hot rage that had consumed me the night before had completely transformed into a cold, deadly resolve. Barbara had spent 5 years making me feel incredibly small, desperately inadequate, and entirely invisible. She had viciously attacked my character, deeply insulted my working-class background, and maliciously tried to rip my sweet, innocent child away from his father. She had significantly underestimated my intelligence, and she had completely overlooked my exceptional professional skills. I was not just the quiet, obedient spreadsheet girl she arrogantly thought I was. I was the incredibly precise, highly trained corporate accountant who had just successfully tracked every single dirty stolen dollar she had meticulously tried to hide. She had confidently initiated this destructive, brutal war, assuming I would immediately cower and retreat into the shadows. But she was about to learn a very harsh, unforgettable lesson about the terrifying absolute power of a woman who has finally had enough. The painful defensive phase was officially permanently over. It was time to aggressively plan our completely devastating counterattack. I sat back in my desk chair, taking a long, slow breath. I let my eyes drift from my laptop screen over to Jasmine. She was standing by the window of my home office, her arms tightly crossed, staring out into the dark suburban street. We had just verified the physical locations and the biological connections, but I knew from years of deep corporate payroll analysis that biological secrets usually carried a very heavy, very expensive financial anchor. I opened a fresh tab on my secure accounting software and began digging directly into the raw data. I bypassed the standard executive summary dashboards and went straight to the general ledger histories. I was looking for the tiny digital footprints, the microscopic anomalies that arrogant people always leave behind when they think no one is watching. I started pulling the 10-year expenditure reports for Richard's primary real estate development firm. It was a massive, sprawling portfolio with hundreds of contractors, vendors, and service providers scattered across the entire country. The sheer volume of transactions was designed to hide mistakes. It was the perfect camouflage for systematic theft. I quickly ran a complex sorting macro specifically targeting recurring monthly payments that fell just below the standard $50,000 mandatory review threshold. My eyes scanned the rapidly cascading columns of numbers. Then I saw it. It started as a tiny, almost invisible pattern. A consistent monthly payment of $49,500, completely identical every single time, perfectly timed on the 15th of every month. I highlighted the vendor line. The payee was listed simply as Suncoast Elite Properties, LLC. I called Jasmine over, pointing at the glowing screen. I told her to look at this specific vendor account. I showed her that Richard had supposedly been paying this company over $500,000 a year for the past 12 years. I asked her to run the corporate registry for Suncoast Elite Properties, LLC. Jasmine leaned over my shoulder, her fingers flying rapidly across her own keyboard. She accessed her secure compliance databases, pulling the state incorporation records. The company was registered in Delaware, which is notorious for corporate secrecy. But Jasmine knew exactly how to pierce those corporate veils. She pulled the underlying tax identification numbers and cross-referenced the registered agents. The primary manager listed for the LLC was not a property manager. It was a private wealth management attorney based entirely in Miami, Florida. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of discovery. I immediately pulled the corresponding internal invoices from Richard's corporate archives. Every single payment authorization was digitally signed, and every single signature belonged to Barbara. She had full administrative proxy access to Richard's operational accounts, a privilege she claimed she needed just to manage the household expenses and charitable donations. But she was not managing household expenses. She was meticulously approving massive fraudulent payments. I pulled the specific line item details for the invoices. They were billed as consulting and administrative overhead for properties Richard supposedly owned in southern Florida. But when I cross-checked the actual physical property deeds against the billing addresses, the buildings did not exist. Barbara was actively funneling massive amounts of real estate capital into absolute thin air. Jasmine let out a low, sharp whistle of pure disbelief. She pointed at the screen and told me that Barbara was not just a cheating wife. She said Barbara was a highly sophisticated, remorseless corporate embezzler. Jasmine quickly began tracing the outbound flow of the money from that initial Delaware LLC. It was a masterful labyrinth of financial deception. The money bounced aggressively from Delaware to a secondary holding company in Nevada, then splintered into 4 different offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But the final destination, the ultimate beneficiary of all those deeply hidden accounts, was always exactly the same. It all funneled directly into the private trust of Marcus Sterling. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. Barbara had not just maintained a secret 33-year-old affair. She had been quietly, systematically draining her powerful husband's multi-million-dollar real estate empire to aggressively fund the lavish, extravagant lifestyle of his absolute worst enemy. She was stealing from the man who gave her everything to violently enrich the man who had actively tried to destroy him. And she was doing it using the very administrative trust Richard had foolishly granted her. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. It was not just an emotional failure. It was a massive, calculated federal crime. My mind raced desperately, trying to connect the final, jagged pieces of this horrifying puzzle. I stared blankly at the staggering millions of dollars missing from the ledger, and suddenly, a terrifying realization slammed into me with the force of a freight train. I suddenly understood exactly why Barbara had chosen last Sunday to dramatically produce that fake DNA test. I understood exactly why she had tried so desperately to publicly frame me for the very infidelity she was actively committing. It had absolutely nothing to do with her twisted obsession over bloodlines or her blatant hatred of my modest background. Those were just the convenient, hateful excuses she used to mask her true motive. I turned to Jasmine, my voice dropping to an urgent, fearful whisper. I told her Barbara was deliberately trying to force a sudden, explosive divorce. I explained that Liam and I had been fighting recently about his chaotic business finances. Last month, I had forcefully insisted on taking complete total control of his company books to finally organize the aggressive debts he owed. I reminded Jasmine that Liam's consulting firm accounts were directly linked to Richard's primary corporate ledger to secure better commercial credit rates. If I took over Liam's accounting, I would immediately gain full unrestricted audit access to the exact same central network Barbara was actively using to steal the money. Jasmine gasped, her dark eyes widening in sudden, terrifying comprehension. She said Barbara knew I was a meticulous corporate accountant. She knew I spent 40 hours a week hunting down minor discrepancies and balancing complex corporate ledgers. Jasmine stated clearly that Barbara realized if I gained full access to that central system, I would spot the fraudulent $49,000 monthly payments in a matter of days. I would instantly see the fake invoices, the dummy Florida properties, and the offshore routing numbers. I was not just an annoying daughter-in-law to her anymore. I was an immediate catastrophic threat to her entire stolen multi-million-dollar operation. The brilliant, wicked strategy of her attack finally made perfect, horrifying sense. By suddenly framing me for marital infidelity and forcefully claiming my son was illegitimate, she was intentionally triggering a massive emotional nuclear bomb within the family. She knew Liam would be entirely consumed by rage and humiliation. She knew Richard would immediately unleash his vicious corporate lawyers to brutally destroy me in mediation. She fully expected me to be completely isolated, panicked, and utterly crushed under the weight of the scandal. She needed me permanently distracted, violently removed from the family circle, and completely stripped of any financial access before I could ever accidentally look at the general ledger. She was willing to gleefully destroy my marriage, traumatize my innocent child, and emotionally shatter her own son just to protect her massive ongoing embezzlement scheme. I felt a sudden profound wave of intense white-hot fury completely wash over me. For 5 exhausting years, I had quietly endured her relentless, cruel insults. I had allowed her to openly mock my sensible clothes and belittle my honest working-class profession. I had silently swallowed my deep personal pride because I foolishly believed that respecting family hierarchy was the right thing to do. She genuinely thought my silence meant I was weak. She thought my dedication to my husband made me a pathetic, easy target. She assumed she could just effortlessly squash me like a bug to protect her stolen fortune, but she had made one absolutely fatal, catastrophic error in her brilliant, wicked calculation. She had deeply underestimated the lethal focused precision of a woman who spends her entire life analyzing raw data. She forgot that I am a woman who catches the tiny microscopic details that arrogant, sloppy people always leave behind. I looked at the glowing laptop screen, the undeniable, irrefutable digital proof of her massive federal crimes laid out in perfect chronological order. This was no longer just a painful, messy family dispute over a shocking DNA test. This was a highly dangerous, multi-million-dollar corporate war, and Barbara had just handed me the exact fully loaded weapon I needed to completely annihilate her entire existence. Jasmine slowly closed her laptop, her expression hardening into absolute cold, unbreakable steel. She told me that we had the clear motive, the exact method, and the undeniable financial proof. She said Barbara thought she was playing an easy game of emotional manipulation, but she had accidentally stumbled into a federal wire fraud investigation. Jasmine warned me that cornered, desperate people with millions of dollars on the line are incredibly dangerous. She said Barbara would undoubtedly strike back with everything she had if she even suspected we possessed these documents. I closed my laptop with a firm, definitive snap. I looked Jasmine straight in the eyes, feeling a powerful, cold sense of absolute calm finally settle completely over my racing heart. I told Jasmine that Barbara was absolutely going to strike back, but she would never get the chance to see us coming. We were not going to argue with her or present this evidence at a screaming family meeting. We were going to methodically, quietly prepare a flawless, devastating legal execution. I was going to use every single skill I had ever learned to ensure that the woman who tried to violently throw me out onto the street would spend the rest of her miserable life locked securely inside a federal prison cell. The time for quiet, polite suffering was officially permanently over. The heavy glass door to my office swung open with a sharp, aggressive crack that made me physically flinch. I looked up from the glowing spreadsheet on my dual monitors, fully expecting to see Elena or one of the junior accounting associates coming in to ask about payroll allocations. Instead, Barbara was standing in the doorway, her expensive designer coat perfectly pressed and her posture radiating absolute unyielding arrogance. The weeping, hysterical mother from the dining room was completely gone. The desperate, panicked woman who had begged her husband for mercy on her knees was nowhere to be found. In her place stood the cold, calculating predator I had always known she truly was. She slowly closed the heavy glass door behind her, deliberately twisting the silver lock until it clicked loudly in the quiet room. I did not stand up to greet her. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact. I silently reached my right hand under the edge of my large wooden desk, my fingers blindly locating my smartphone. I seamlessly slid my thumb across the smooth screen, navigating entirely by muscle memory to the voice memo application. With one quick, precise tap, I hit record, completely securing the digital audio file before I even opened my mouth. I asked her in a flat, emotionless tone exactly what she was doing in my secure corporate office. I reminded her that Richard had explicitly banned her from stepping foot on any company property, and that security would not hesitate to forcibly remove her if I hit the panic button under my desk. Barbara let out a short, harsh laugh that held absolutely zero humor. She confidently walked over to the leather guest chair positioned directly across from my desk and slowly, deliberately sat down. She casually crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of her expensive wool skirt. She told me not to bother threatening her with cheap security guards because we both knew I wanted to hear exactly what she had to say. She leaned her upper body forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands lightly on the edge of my desk. Her dark eyes narrowed into thin, dangerous slits. She stated clearly that she was well aware Jasmine and I had been quietly digging through the general ledger archives. She claimed she had heavily compensated insiders working in the IT department who happily notified her the absolute second Jasmine triggered the external LLC registry searches. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that we had successfully located the Florida property management accounts and the subsequent offshore routing numbers. A cold, heavy knot formed rapidly in the pit of my stomach, but I forced my facial expression to remain entirely blank. I did not confirm or deny her aggressive allegations. I simply asked her what she planned to do about it. I told her that she was already facing an incredibly brutal, devastating divorce and the absolute total loss of her pristine social reputation. I pointed out that she had actively destroyed her own life by forcing a fake DNA test just to maliciously punish me. I asked her why she thought she had any leverage left to negotiate with anyone. Barbara smiled, a slow, wicked, terrifying smile that made the blood run completely cold in my veins. She told me that I was severely underestimating how desperately she wanted to protect her private financial assets. She said the ugly, humiliating divorce was just a temporary social inconvenience. She was perfectly willing to endure a few nasty country club whispers if it meant she could quietly retain the millions of dollars she had systematically siphoned away over the past decade. But she knew that if Jasmine and I officially handed those meticulously documented ledger files directly to Richard's ruthless corporate attorneys, or worse, to the federal authorities, she would instantly face massive criminal indictment. She would actively lose the stolen Florida estate, the luxury vehicles, and her entire remaining fortune. She stated firmly that she was absolutely not going to let a common working-class spreadsheet girl take away the luxurious life she had rightfully earned by putting up with Richard's insufferable arrogance for 40 long, miserable years. I stared at her in pure, unadulterated disbelief. I asked her how exactly she planned to stop us when we already possessed the irrefutable digital proof of her massive federal crimes. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She told me she had spent the last 2 days carefully crafting an incredibly detailed, completely fictitious narrative of extreme corporate malfeasance. She claimed she had maliciously manufactured a vast collection of fake emails, heavily doctored financial memos, and manipulated authorization logs that painted a horrifying picture of systemic internal corruption. But the truly sickening part of her elaborate, wicked scheme was not the fake documents themselves. It was the specific target she had chosen to absolutely ruin. Barbara stated with chilling absolute certainty that if I did not permanently delete the Florida LLC files and immediately cease all further financial investigations, she would release her manufactured evidence to the authorities. She explicitly threatened to publicly frame Liam, her own biological son, for the massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme she had orchestrated. She claimed she had spent years quietly ensuring that Liam's digital authorization codes were deeply embedded in the foundational approval chains for the offshore accounts. She said she had aggressively encouraged him to link his consulting firm to Richard's general ledger, specifically so she could use his business as a convenient disposable shield if she ever got caught. The sheer breathtaking evil of her words hit me with the staggering physical force of a heavy concrete block. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea violently wash over me. She was actually threatening to maliciously destroy her own flesh and blood to save herself. She was perfectly willing to intentionally send the son she had raised, lied to, and aggressively manipulated for 33 years directly to federal prison just so she could comfortably retain her stolen offshore wealth. She knew absolutely that a massive public federal investigation would permanently destroy Liam's fragile consulting firm, annihilate his professional reputation, and completely shatter his entire emotional reality just days after discovering his true biological identity. She was weaponizing his profound lifelong trust in her, using his desperate childhood need for a mother's love as the ultimate fatal weapon to completely obliterate his future. I gripped the smooth wooden edge of my desk so incredibly tightly that my knuckles instantly turned stark bone white. I asked her how she could possibly do something so horribly violently destructive to her own child. I demanded to know how any mother could look her son in the eye and then actively plan to maliciously frame him for a federal crime. Barbara did not even blink. She did not show a single microscopic shred of maternal guilt or basic human decency. She simply shrugged her shoulders with casual, chilling indifference. She stated flatly that Liam was weak. She claimed he had always been incredibly soft, far too overly emotional, and utterly lacking the ruthless, predatory instinct necessary to truly survive in their elite, wealthy world. She said he was a massive, continuous disappointment to her, and she was not going to allow a weak, emotional man to drag her down with him. She firmly declared that survival requires difficult, brutal choices, and she had always chosen herself above absolutely everyone else. The suffocating tension in my small office skyrocketed to a dangerous, explosive breaking point. Every single defensive, protective instinct I possessed as a devoted, loyal wife violently flared to life. For 5 exhausting, agonizing years, I had quietly accepted her relentless verbal abuse. I had silently tolerated her vicious, pointed insults regarding my modest background. I had willingly allowed her to maliciously mock my sensible clothes, my dedicated career, and my inherent basic worth. I had absorbed all of her toxic, hateful poison to protect Liam from having to confront his mother's true wicked nature. But threatening my husband, threatening to actively maliciously ruin an innocent man's life to protect her stolen illegal fortune was a massive permanent line she could never uncross. I looked directly into her cold, dark, predatory eyes, and I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that we were not just dealing with a greedy, vindictive mother-in-law anymore. We were actively engaging with a remorseless, highly dangerous sociopath. She was a woman who viewed human beings, including her own son, as completely disposable resources to be used, drained, and quickly discarded when they were no longer beneficial. This was no longer just about seeking justice for a humiliating, fake DNA test. This was no longer about petty family vengeance or dramatic Sunday dinner arguments. This was about absolute fundamental survival. It was about violently, decisively destroying a predator before she could permanently destroy the man I loved more than breathing. I took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath, forcing my rapid, frantic heartbeat to settle into a cold, rhythmic military cadence. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk, mirroring her exact aggressive physical posture. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or show any signs of emotional weakness. I simply asked her to clarify her exact demands for the official record. I wanted her to clearly articulate her vicious criminal threats, making absolutely certain the hidden audio recorder captured every single distinct malicious syllable. Barbara smiled, arrogantly, genuinely believing her ruthless intimidation tactics had completely broken my resolve. She stated her demands with absolute brutal precision. She explicitly instructed me to permanently erase all local and cloud-based copies of the Florida LLC transactions by midnight tonight. She demanded that Jasmine immediately wipe her compliance search histories and completely close the external investigation logs. She told me to quietly walk away from the general ledger archives and strongly encouraged Liam to accept whatever minor pathetic divorce settlement Richard eventually offered. She firmly promised that if we fully complied, she would simply quietly disappear to Florida and leave Liam completely unharmed. But she reiterated with a dark, chilling venom that if we defied her, if we dared to expose her offshore accounts to Richard or the federal authorities, she would instantly electronically trigger the release of the fabricated evidence framing Liam for the entire multi-million-dollar theft. She confidently declared that she would gladly watch her own son burn to ashes before she surrendered a single stolen dime. I held her confident, arrogant gaze for a long, terrible moment, completely memorizing the absolute wicked certainty etched deeply into her face. I slowly nodded my head, giving her the exact silent, obedient submission she desperately needed to see. I told her I perfectly understood the immense severe gravity of the complex situation. I said I fully recognized exactly what was violently at stake, and I assured her I would immediately discuss her urgent, non-negotiable demands with Jasmine. Barbara stood up gracefully, smoothing her expensive designer coat with a sickening, satisfied smirk. She told me I was finally making a smart, practical decision. She said it was truly a shame it took a massive, devastating family crisis for me to finally understand exactly how power really worked in the real world. She confidently turned around and walked purposefully out of my office, the heavy glass door clicking loudly and firmly shut behind her. I sat alone in the quiet, suffocating stillness of my office, my hands shaking violently from the massive residual adrenaline coursing rapidly through my veins. I reached under the solid wooden desk and carefully pulled my smartphone out of its hidden position. I tapped the screen firmly, immediately stopping the long active audio recording and quickly securing the raw unedited digital file to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I had the clear, indisputable proof of her brutal, malicious extortion. I had the raw, terrifying audio of her actively threatening to falsely frame her own biological son for a massive federal crime. Her extreme, desperate arrogance had just provided the ultimate lethal ammunition we desperately needed. She genuinely thought her vicious, horrifying threats would permanently paralyze me with absolute fear. She thought I would instantly cower, violently submit, and quietly destroy the very evidence that could permanently lock her away. But she had fundamentally, deeply underestimated the ferocious, unbreakable strength of a woman fiercely protecting her family. She had just guaranteed her own absolute spectacular destruction, and I was going to thoroughly enjoy watching her entire wicked empire burn violently to the ground. The heavy glass door of my office had barely clicked shut before I was moving. My hands were still shaking slightly from the massive adrenaline dump of Barbara's horrific threats, but my mind was incredibly sharp and entirely focused. I immediately picked up my phone and called Jasmine, telling her to meet me at my house right away. I rapidly packed my silver laptop, my encrypted backup drives, and every single physical financial file I had managed to print. I was absolutely not going to let that vicious, arrogant predator destroy my husband and ruin my family. When I finally arrived home, Liam was completely exhausted, finally sleeping a restless, fitful sleep in the darkened guest bedroom. I gently closed his door, standing there for a brief second to listen to his quiet breathing before I walked directly into my home office. Jasmine was already there, rapidly setting up her heavy secured compliance laptops and organizing her thick legal pads. We did not waste a single second on polite pleasantries or emotional discussions. We immediately transformed my quiet suburban home office into a highly secure, intensely focused forensic war room. For the next 72 hours, Jasmine and I completely ceased to exist in the normal outside world. We did not sleep a single minute. We barely stopped to eat. We survived entirely on bitter black coffee, stale delivery pizza, and the sheer white-hot fury burning rapidly in our veins. The physical toll was absolutely brutal. My eyes burned intensely from staring relentlessly at the glowing dual monitors, and my lower back ached sharply from sitting hunched over the keyboard for days on end. But every single time I felt my heavy eyelids start to violently droop, I vividly remembered Barbara sitting casually in my office, arrogantly threatening to send my innocent husband to a federal prison. That horrifying, sickening memory was like a direct, continuous injection of pure adrenaline. We were actively fighting for Liam's actual life and for the safety of my young son. Failure was absolutely not an option we were willing to entertain. We executed a flawless, meticulous forensic audit that would have made a seasoned federal investigator weep with pure joy. Barbara had been incredibly bold and wildly arrogant, but she was also incredibly sloppy. She genuinely believed that because she was the wealthy, untouchable matriarch of a powerful family, no one would ever dare question her broad financial authority. She relied heavily on the sheer overwhelming volume of Richard's massive daily real estate transactions to completely hide her continuous systematic theft. But she fundamentally misunderstood exactly how a highly trained corporate payroll specialist operates. I do not just look at the massive millions swirling around the top of the ledger. I look intensely at the absolute microscopic details hidden deeply at the bottom. I started pulling every single digital signature log associated with the fraudulent Suncoast Elite Properties invoices. I meticulously cross-referenced the exact timestamps of those illicit approvals against Barbara's personal high society travel calendar and Richard's highly publicized corporate board meeting schedules. The pattern we uncovered was absolutely staggering in its pure calculated malice. I discovered that Barbara had been actively overriding the standard dual authentication protocols by secretly mirroring Richard's primary administrative IP address. Jasmine used her high-level corporate compliance access to officially subpoena the back-channel digital routing numbers, mapping out the entire complex journey of the stolen corporate funds. We printed out hundreds of pages of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and dummy corporate filings completely covering the four walls of my home office with undeniable, irrefutable documentary evidence. We used thick red markers to draw explicit, undeniable connections between the fake Florida landscaping invoices, the Delaware shell companies, and the final offshore Cayman Islands accounts completely controlled by Marcus Sterling. We explicitly proved that Barbara had been manually forging Richard's digital executive authorization code on dozens of high-level internal documents, effectively bypassing the standard accounting security checks. She had systematically drained millions of dollars of raw liquid capital directly out of the primary operational accounts, while artificially inflating the projected property development budgets to completely mask the massive continuous cash bleed. It was an absolute masterpiece of prolonged corporate fraud, but we had just successfully dismantled her entire deceptive empire piece by bloody piece. By the dawn of the third sleepless day, my home office looked exactly like the bustling command center of a massive federal criminal investigation. We had the exact transaction dates, the precise routing numbers, the forged digital signatures, and the ultimate offshore destinations perfectly documented and securely backed up on 3 separate encrypted hard drives. We had definitively proven her total absolute guilt. But as I ran one final comprehensive diagnostic sweep of the master general ledger to ensure our timeline was completely airtight, a sudden flashing red anomaly on the screen made my heart completely stop in my chest. I rapidly blinked my burning eyes, trying to quickly process the complex string of pending transaction codes glowing brightly against the dark software dashboard. I called Jasmine over my voice, completely hoarse and incredibly tight with sudden terrifying panic. I pointed a shaking finger at a massive pending wire transfer that had just been quietly initiated in the system holding queue. Barbara was not just trying to aggressively intimidate me into dropping the internal investigation. She was actively simultaneously triggering her final catastrophic exit strategy. The glowing green numbers on the screen revealed a newly initiated authorized wire transfer for exactly $5 million. It was systematically, aggressively pulling every single remaining drop of liquid capital from Richard's 3 primary emergency corporate reserve accounts. The massive transfer was already fully processed through the initial internal security gateways, using Barbara's stolen executive proxy access, and it was heavily encrypted to avoid standard banking flags. But Jasmine, utilizing her specialized federal tracking software, managed to quickly forcibly unmask the final destination code. The $5 million was scheduled to be permanently wired directly into the untouchable Cayman Islands offshore account, completely controlled by her biological lover, Marcus Sterling. And the absolutely most terrifying detail was the exact automated execution time embedded in the digital code. The massive transfer was strictly programmed to automatically clear the final international banking hurdles and vanish completely out of the country this upcoming Friday at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. We were suddenly operating on an incredibly tight, terrifyingly fast-ticking clock. It was currently late Wednesday morning. We had exactly 60 hours before Barbara successfully stole the last $5 million of Richard's liquid fortune and permanently vanished into the sunny, wealthy shadows of southern Florida. The absolute horrifying reality of her master plan suddenly clicked into perfect, undeniable focus. She knew Richard was aggressively consulting top-tier ruthless divorce attorneys who would inevitably start freezing her personal domestic assets by the end of the week. She knew her luxurious, wealthy lifestyle in Seattle was completely permanently over. She was executing a highly coordinated, massive final smash-and-grab operation. She intended to completely wipe out Richard's remaining liquid cash reserves, quietly abandon her ruined marriage, and fly directly to Miami to live in absolute unbothered luxury with her former lover. but her plan was significantly more sinister than a simple cowardly escape. By leaving the fake digital breadcrumbs directly tied to Liam's consulting firm, she was intentionally ensuring that when Richard finally realized the massive reserve money was gone, the federal authorities would instantly blame Liam for the $5 million theft. She was going to completely ruin her own biological son, leave him facing decades in a federal prison facility, and walk away incredibly wealthy and entirely free from any legal consequences. Her boundless greed had completely consumed whatever tiny shred of humanity she had left. Jasmine slammed her hand down hard on my wooden desk, her dark eyes blazing with terrifying absolute fury. She stated forcefully that we could not simply hand this massive pile of evidence over to Richard or the local police right now. If we went to the authorities prematurely, Barbara would instantly realize she was trapped. She would aggressively deny everything, immediately trigger the fabricated digital evidence framing Liam, and use her incredibly expensive defense lawyers to drag the investigation out for years, while the $5 million safely disappeared offshore forever. We absolutely could not afford a long, messy public legal battle. We needed a sudden, absolute, and completely devastating surgical strike. I stared at the pending $5 million wire transfer, glowing ominously on the monitor, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of the ticking clock pressing violently against my tired shoulders. Barbara thought she had perfectly orchestrated the ultimate flawless betrayal. She arrogantly believed she was the smartest, most powerful player on the board. She thought she could completely destroy my family frame, my husband for a federal crime, and walk away incredibly rich without facing a single consequence. But she had made the absolute worst mistake of her entire privileged, arrogant life. She had given a highly trained, exhausted, and fiercely protective mother a firm, unyielding deadline. I looked at Jasmine, feeling a cold, dark determination completely override my severe physical exhaustion. We had exactly 60 hours to completely trap the predator, permanently freeze the stolen offshore assets, and execute a public absolute destruction so incredibly devastating that Barbara would never be able to show her face in the civilized world ever again. Jasmine and I stared intensely at the ticking digital clock on my dual monitors. Going directly to the local police or the federal authorities right now was a massive, catastrophic mistake. Federal financial investigations move at a notoriously glacial pace. If we filed a formal official report, Barbara would immediately hire a team of vicious defense lawyers, and that $5 million would completely vanish into the Cayman Islands long before a judge could even sign a temporary freeze order. We desperately needed someone who could move significantly faster and far more ruthlessly than the law. We needed the one man Barbara truly feared above all else. We needed Richard. Richard had spent the last 5 years treating me like absolute invisible dirt on his expensive Italian leather shoes. He constantly looked right through me at lavish family dinners. He openly and maliciously mocked my dedicated career as a simple corporate payroll clerk. But right now, in this incredibly dangerous high-stakes moment, he was the exact weapon we needed to permanently stop her. Thursday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that whipped sharply through the busy downtown streets. Jasmine and I walked confidently into the towering glass and steel lobby of Richard's massive commercial real estate headquarters in downtown Seattle. We completely bypassed the standard reception desk and strode purposefully toward the private executive elevator. His frantic senior executive assistant desperately tried to physically block our path, loudly claiming that Richard was entirely unavailable and firmly locked in aggressive closed-door meetings with his elite divorce counsel. I did not stop walking for a single second. I forcefully pushed past her and pushed open the heavy, solid oak double doors leading directly into his massive corner office. Richard was standing rigidly by the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, looking furiously out over the wealthy city he practically owned. He looked incredibly ragged, deeply exhausted, and physically older than he had just a few days ago. But his dark, intimidating eyes flared with immediate, terrifying anger the absolute second he saw me standing uninvited in his doorway. He turned around, his voice echoing loudly of the polished wood paneling, and demanded to know exactly what I thought I was doing, interrupting his private corporate sanctuary. He told me to get out of his sight before he called his private security team to have me forcefully escorted out of the building. I did not flinch. I did not apologize or awkwardly back down. I walked directly over to his massive polished mahogany desk, and I sat down heavily in the high-backed leather guest chair. Jasmine stood silently and imposingly by the closed door, functioning as a quiet, highly trained guard. I reached deep into my heavy leather work bag and slowly pulled out a massive, thick black binder. It was meticulously organized, heavily packed with hundreds of pages of detailed bank records, raw wire transfers, and complex corporate filings. Every single fraudulent transaction was carefully categorized with bright red and yellow sticky tabs. I placed my right hand completely flat on top of the heavy black cover. I looked Richard directly in his furious dark eyes, and I slid the binder slowly and deliberately straight across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of him. It was the exact same agonizing, deliberate sliding motion Barbara had maliciously used with the crisp white testing envelope at the dining room table just days ago. It was the exact same physical posturing she used when she arrogantly tried to completely destroy my entire life and throw me out onto the street. I mirrored her cruel action flawlessly. But instead of a fake manufactured scandal, I was sliding a loaded financial gun directly into his hands. I looked up at the terrifying, powerful patriarch of the family, and I told him in a cold, flat, clinical voice that he needed to sit down, shut up, and pay incredibly close attention because I was about to save his entire real estate empire from total, absolute ruin. Richard stared blankly at the thick black binder, his square jaw locked into a tight, furious line. He looked at me with a dangerous, simmering hostility, but something in my unwavering, steely expression made him pause. He slowly, cautiously lowered his large frame into his leather executive chair. He reached out with a slightly trembling hand and flipped open the heavy black cover. I did not let him speak a single word. I immediately forcefully directed his eyes to the first bright red tab. I explained in an incredibly precise professional tone that for the past 12 consecutive years, his elegant, devoted wife Barbara had been systematically, aggressively draining his liquid corporate assets. I walked him methodically through the incredibly dense financial spreadsheets. I showed him the fake commercial landscaping invoices, the bogus high-level consulting fees, and the completely phantom property maintenance accounts located in southern Florida. I watched the vibrant color rapidly, violently drain from his weathered face as he recognized his own trusted company letterhead permanently attached to completely fraudulent external payments. I explained exactly how Barbara had cleverly used her authorized administrative proxy access to quietly approve $50,000 payments bypassing his mandatory review thresholds. The absolute sheer volume of the stolen money was staggering. It was a massive multi-million-dollar continuous bleed right out of his primary operational accounts. Then I told him to flip the page to the bright yellow tab. I instructed him to look very closely at the ultimate final destination of the stolen corporate funds. I watched his dark eyes scan the complex offshore routing numbers and the hidden limited liability company registrations. I watched the horrible, sickening realization violently crash completely over him as he read the name of the primary registered agent. Marcus Sterling, the man who had biological fathered the son Richard had raised, the very man Richard absolutely despised more than any other human being on earth. The man who went publicly bankrupt 20 years ago was currently living in a $5 million waterfront Miami mansion paid for entirely by Richard's incredibly hard-earned money. Richard physically gripped the thick edges of his massive mahogany desk, his large knuckles turning completely stark bone white. He was breathing incredibly heavily, a low, dangerous, guttural growl forming deep in his chest. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated homicidal rage. He looked like a man who was fully prepared to commit a violent physical murder right there in his corporate office. I did not let him explode. I cut directly through his rapidly rising rage and told him the absolute worst, most urgent part of the entire investigation. I told him we were actively running out of time. I explained firmly that Barbara was highly intelligent and deeply terrified. She absolutely knew Richard was actively freezing her personal domestic checking accounts and cutting off her expensive platinum credit cards. I told him she had already quietly initiated a massive final desperate wire transfer directly out of his primary corporate emergency cash reserve. I pointed to the final printed page in the thick binder, highlighting the pending transaction code. She was attempting to move exactly $5 million. It was the absolute last drop of liquid capital she could easily access before the aggressive divorce attorneys locked everything down. I explained that the massive transfer was strictly programmed to automatically clear the final international banking security hurdles tomorrow at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. Once that money officially hit the offshore Cayman Islands accounts, it would immediately vanish entirely into the Florida ether, and Richard would never see a single dime of it ever again. Barbara would quietly board a private flight to Miami and live in absolute unbothered luxury with his worst enemy completely funded by his life's work. Richard slammed his heavy fist violently onto the desk, rattling his expensive computer monitors and sending a severe shockwave through the room. He reached for his phone, screaming that he was going to call the federal authorities, the banking executives, and the police right this exact second. He wanted to violently throw her in handcuffs immediately and watch her publicly rot in a jail cell. Jasmine quickly stepped forward from the door, her voice ringing out with absolute sharp commanding authority. She ordered Richard to put the phone down immediately. She explained the stark legal reality of high-level corporate financial crimes. If he called the police right now, Barbara would simply claim it was a minor marital accounting dispute. She would heavily lawyer up, instantly deny absolutely everything, and aggressively claim Liam was the one manipulating the corporate consulting accounts. She had already threatened to maliciously frame Liam for the entire operation, and she possessed the doctored digital logs to make it look incredibly convincing. I leaned across the desk, locking my eyes firmly onto his furious gaze. I told him we could not afford a messy long-term public legal battle where she had the chance to hide the assets or blame an innocent man. I explained the fatal flaw in her desperate exit strategy. The offshore Cayman Islands accounts strictly required a complex dual authentication digital signature to officially release funds over $1 million. She needed her administrative proxy code, and she needed Richard's direct executive biometric clearance code. I smiled a very cold, very dark smile. I told him Barbara did not have his biometric code, but she was absolutely planning to digitally forge it tomorrow afternoon to forcefully push the $5 million through the final gateway. I told him that was the exact precise moment we strike. We do not block the transfer today. We completely silently let her initiate the final forgery. We let her type in the fake clearance codes and aggressively hit the execute button. By allowing her to actively commit the massive wire fraud in real time, we would capture the exact digital footprint of her terminal crime. We would catch her completely red-handed committing a severe federal offense right from her own personal laptop. We would perfectly trap the predator inside her own wicked, incredibly greedy cage. Richard slowly lowered the phone, his dark eyes gleaming with a terrifying absolute understanding. We were going to silently watch her walk straight into a federal prison cell. The heavy mahogany doors of Richard's corporate boardroom clicked shut, sealing us inside a fortress of glass and steel hovering 40 stories above the busy downtown Seattle streets. The room was absolutely freezing chilled by aggressive commercial air conditioning that matched the cold, ruthless atmosphere of the men sitting around the massive table. Richard's personal legal team from Morrison & Associates had arrived within 20 minutes of our initial meeting. They were high-powered, aggressive corporate sharks dressed in impeccable charcoal suits, men who spent their entire careers crushing rival businesses and bearing financial scandals. Normally, men like this would look right through a standard payroll accountant like me. They would dismiss my modest background and my sensible shoes. But today, the dynamic was entirely different. Today, I was not the invisible daughter-in-law or the simple numbers girl. I was the architect of the exact financial map they desperately needed to save Richard's empire, and they hung on to absolutely every single word I said. Jasmine stood at the head of the long polished table, her secure compliance laptop connected directly to the massive projection screen that dominated the far wall. She was brilliant and entirely unflappable. We had one singular objective to perfectly execute before Friday afternoon. We had to quietly and completely freeze the outbound routing numbers that connected Richard's domestic corporate reserves to Marcus Sterling's offshore Cayman Islands accounts. But we could not simply block the transaction. If we just locked the account, Barbara would immediately receive a standard banking error code. She would instantly realize she was caught. She would completely abort the $5 million wire transfer, immediately destroy her laptop, and trigger the fabricated evidence she had planted to maliciously frame my husband for her entire 33-year-old criminal operation. We absolutely could not afford to let her panic. We needed her to feel completely secure, perfectly confident, and wildly arrogant, right up until the exact second the federal trap snapped shut on her wrists. Jasmine brilliantly proposed deploying a dummy endpoint. It was a highly sophisticated digital sting operation normally reserved for massive international cybercrimes. We were going to create a flawless digital mirror of the offshore banking portal. When Barbara logged into the corporate system to execute her final desperate smash and grab the internal network, would silently reroute her connection to our secure dummy server. She would see the exact same interface, the identical confirmation screens, and the familiar green verification checkmarks she was accustomed to seeing. To her arrogant eyes, the $5 million transfer would look perfectly successful. She would genuinely believe she had just funneled the last of Richard's liquid wealth directly to her biological lover. But in reality, the money would never leave the heavily monitored domestic holding account. Instead, the massive unauthorized attempt to move $5 million across international borders using forged digital credentials would automatically trigger a mandatory severe federal wire fraud alert directly to the Department of Justice. The execution of this highly complex trap required absolute meticulous precision. For the next 48 hours, I sat hunched over my silver laptop, working directly alongside Richard's elite cybersecurity engineers. We did not sleep a single minute. The physical exhaustion was a heavy, crushing weight pressing down on my shoulders, but I refused to close my burning eyes. I systematically mapped out the exact approval pathways Barbara had been manipulating for the past 12 years. I provided the engineers with the specific internal ledger codes, the exact timestamps of her previous fraudulent landscaping invoices, and the precise digital footprint of her administrative proxy access. We had to ensure that our dummy endpoint seamlessly accepted her specific forged biometric inputs without accidentally triggering any internal standard accounting flags prematurely. Richard paced relentlessly at the back of the massive boardroom like a caged, furious animal. The sheer profound humiliation of his situation was actively radiating from his large frame. He was a man who had built a multi-million-dollar real estate dynasty through sheer aggressive force of will. He had spent his entire life controlling absolutely everything and everyone around him. Now he was forcefully sidelined, watching his entire legacy hang by a fragile digital thread, while the daughter-in-law he had spent 5 years treating like disposable trash worked desperately to save him. Every time I uncovered another hidden shell company or exposed another one of Barbara's fabricated consulting fees, I saw his jaw lock tighter and tighter. He was finally seeing the absolute horrifying reality of the woman he had married. He was seeing the cold, calculating sociopath who had gladly funded his absolute worst enemy using his own hard-earned wealth. But to his credit, he did not interfere. He let Jasmine and me lead the incredibly dangerous operation, completely submitting to our combined professional expertise. Thursday night slowly bled into a grey, rainy Friday morning. The empty coffee cups piled up rapidly on the polished mahogany table, and the air in the boardroom grew thick with stale tension and raw nervous energy. I took a brief, agonizing moment to step out into the quiet corporate hallway and call Liam. He was still safely at home, deeply traumatized and emotionally paralyzed by the horrifying loss of his entire fundamental identity. Hearing his quiet, broken voice through the phone speaker felt like a physical, jagged knife twisting in my chest. He asked me if everything was going to be okay. He sounded so incredibly small, so fundamentally shattered by the mother who had aggressively demanded perfection while secretly living a life of absolute filthy corruption. I gripped the phone tightly, forcing my voice to remain strong, steady, and completely reassuring. I promised him that the nightmare was almost completely over. I swore to him that the woman who had hurt him would never be able to touch our family ever again. I hung up the phone feeling a fresh, potent surge of pure, white-hot adrenaline rush completely through my exhausted body. I was going entirely to war for my husband, and I was not going to show one single ounce of mercy. By 1 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the digital trap was completely set, perfectly primed, and fully operational. The dummy endpoint was actively mirroring the Cayman Islands routing protocol. The specialized tracking software was directly linked to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. All we had to do now was wait for the predator to confidently walk into the cage. The heavy, agonizing wait was absolute psychological torture. We all gathered around the massive projection screen in the darkened boardroom. Richard sat heavily in his leather executive chair, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. Jasmine's elite legal team stood silently along the back wall, their arms tightly crossed. Jasmine and I sat side by side at the front desk, our eyes locked onto the central monitoring dashboard. The digital clock on the screen seemed to actively mock us, the bright white numbers changing with an agonizingly slow, deliberate pace. 1:15, 1:45, 2:15. The absolute silence in the massive room was so heavy it felt completely suffocating. I vividly pictured Barbara in my mind. She was likely sitting in her lavish, expensive bedroom at the mansion, completely surrounded by her pristine designer luggage. She probably had a glass of premium imported champagne resting on her antique vanity. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated the ultimate flawless betrayal. She thought she had successfully framed my innocent husband, completely destroyed my marriage, and secured her own permanent, luxurious freedom. She was waiting for the perfect time to strike, confident that the stupid, simple numbers girl she despised was currently crying at home, entirely too weak to stop her. Her boundless, sickening arrogance was her absolute greatest vulnerability. At exactly 2:52 in the afternoon, the primary monitoring dashboard let out a sharp, distinct digital ping. A bright yellow indicator light suddenly flashed to life in the upper left corner of the massive projection screen. The entire boardroom collectively stopped breathing. Jasmine leaned forward, her fingers flying rapidly across her keyboard to trace the incoming connection. It was an active, authorized login. The IP address pinged perfectly and undeniably to the private secure network inside Richard's suburban mansion. Barbara was inside the banking portal. We watched in stunned absolute silence as her digital ghost began to move systematically through the complex corporate accounting system. It was an incredibly surreal, terrifying experience watching the invisible mechanics of a massive, multi-million-dollar theft unfold in real time. We saw her cursor actively navigate past the standard executive summary dashboards, completely bypassing the daily operational ledgers. She moved with the incredibly fast-practiced precision of a highly experienced thief. She knew exactly where the emergency liquid cash reserves were deeply buried. The digital clock ticked relentlessly toward the 3 o'clock hour. 2:56, 2:58. The heavy, crushing tension in the room skyrocketed to an almost unbearable physical limit. I could hear Richard's ragged, shallow breathing echoing loudly from the head of the table. I gripped the smooth wooden edge of the desk so incredibly tightly that my fingernails bit painfully into my own palms. "Come on," I whispered silently in my head. "Take the bait. Just take the bait." At exactly 3 o'clock, the primary screen violently shifted. Barbara had officially accessed the final outbound wire transfer terminal. The massive glowing numbers appeared on our monitor in stark high definition. $5 million, the absolute remaining entirety of Richard's liquid corporate safety net. She entered the routing numbers. The exact fraudulent Cayman Islands routing numbers we had meticulously intercepted and securely mirrored to our dummy server. The system immediately generated an automated prompt requiring the final dual biometric authentication to release funds exceeding the $1 million threshold. This was the absolute critical point of no return. This was the exact moment where she had to actively, knowingly cross the line into severe federal forgery. We stared at the loading bar, holding our collective breath as the system waited for the secondary executive approval. There was a long, agonizing 10-second delay. I vividly imagined Barbara sitting at her computer, carefully connecting the specialized digital fingerprint scanner to her laptop port. I imagined her pulling up the high-resolution stolen copy of Richard's biometric thumbprint that she had undoubtedly acquired years ago for this exact catastrophic purpose. She was actively stealing his identity to completely finish stealing his entire life. Suddenly, the screen flashed bright, vibrant green. Authorization accepted. The secondary forged biometric signature had cleared the initial internal gateway. She had actually done it. She had committed the massive terminal crime. We watched as her cursor moved to the bottom right corner of the portal and confidently clicked the final execute button. In her lavish bedroom, Barbara was currently looking at a beautifully fabricated confirmation screen telling her that $5 million was safely, successfully flying across the ocean toward her biological lover. She was entirely oblivious to the absolute violent reality of her current situation. In our darkened corporate war room, the massive projection screen instantly exploded into violent flashing red warnings. The trap had successfully snapped completely and permanently shut. The heavy dummy endpoint had violently caught the entire $5 million transfer, instantly freezing the funds securely within a specialized domestic holding vault. The massive, unauthorized attempt to illegally move millions to an offshore tax haven, using forged executive credentials, automatically, cleanly, and instantly triggered the severe federal wire fraud alerts. Jasmine slammed her hand down triumphantly on the table, letting out a sharp, loud breath of pure, unadulterated relief. Her specialized compliance monitors were actively lighting up with incoming verification codes from the Department of Justice and the FBI Financial Crimes Division. The federal automated systems had instantly locked onto Barbara's specific IP address, perfectly documenting the exact time, the exact location, and the exact forged digital signatures used in the massive federal crime. It was a completely flawless, airtight execution. We had the undeniable, irrefutable evidence. We had the exact transaction logs. We had the completely frozen stolen assets. And we had successfully prevented Barbara from releasing her fabricated malicious files to frame Liam. She was completely, utterly, permanently trapped. Richard slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up. His massive frame seemed to completely fill the silent room. He looked at the flashing red federal alerts on the projection screen, and a dark, terrifyingly satisfied smile slowly spread across his weathered face. He looked at Jasmine, and then he turned his dark, intense gaze completely onto me. He did not say a single word, but the profound, absolute respect radiating from his eyes was completely undeniable. We had successfully executed the ultimate corporate legal strike, and the wicked, tyrannical queen of the family was about to face the absolute devastating fury of the federal government. The long, agonizing war was finally perfectly over, and justice was actively speeding toward her front door. The private aviation terminal at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was a massive cathedral of tinted glass and polished brushed steel designed specifically to completely insulate the ultra-wealthy from the inconvenient, noisy realities of the normal working-class world. It was late Friday afternoon, and a relentless, punishing gray rain was aggressively battering against the massive panoramic windows, perfectly matching the incredibly heavy, suffocating tension currently building inside the exclusive VIP lounge. We were absolutely not there to catch a luxury flight or celebrate a corporate merger. We were there to execute a flawless, entirely devastating corporate and familial execution. I stood silently near the back of the incredibly quiet room, my hands folded neatly and tightly in front of me, my posture absolutely rigid and prepared for war. Beside me stood Jasmine, her dark, intelligent eyes tracking the rain-slicked tarmac outside her posture, radiating the calm, lethal confidence of a seasoned apex predator who knew the trap was perfectly primed. Richard was pacing relentlessly back and forth across the thick, imported Persian rug, his incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes making absolutely no sound on the luxurious fabric. He looked exactly like a man who had violently aged an entire decade in the last 72 agonizing hours. The sheer breathtaking magnitude of his wife's incredible multi-million-dollar betrayal had completely hollowed out his typically arrogant face, leaving absolutely nothing behind but cold, dark, unadulterated fury. And sitting heavily on a plush leather sofa, completely silent and painfully pale, was my husband Liam. He looked absolutely physically and emotionally shattered. The strong, wonderful man I loved significantly more than breathing was currently bracing his entire soul to watch his own mother be arrested for a massive, unforgivable federal crime. I slowly walked over and gently placed my hand firmly on his shaking shoulder. He desperately reached up and gripped my fingers so incredibly tightly that my knuckles instantly ached, but I absolutely did not pull away. We were actively surrounded by a small, highly trained army of devastatingly powerful men. Richard's elite corporate legal team from Morrison and Associates stood in a tight defensive cluster near the polished mahogany wet bar, holding thick leather briefcases packed entirely with damning financial evidence. And standing incredibly quietly by the main frosted glass entrance, wearing perfectly tailored dark suits and completely unreadable stoic expressions, were 3 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. The digital trap was perfectly securely set. The $5 million wire transfer Barbara genuinely thought she had successfully sent to the Cayman Islands was currently frozen solid in a domestic federal holding vault heavily monitored by the Department of Justice. We were all simply waiting in the cold, quiet room for the incredibly arrogant architect of this massive, agonizing nightmare to finally walk blindly through the door. At exactly 4:15 in the afternoon, a sleek black extended town car pulled smoothly and silently onto the restricted private tarmac directly outside the terminal building. The heavy freezing rain beaded instantly off its pristine, freshly waxed surface. I felt my heart suddenly accelerate violently, aggressively hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But I forced my breathing to remain incredibly slow and strictly controlled. I absolutely refused to show a single physical sign of weakness in this final defining moment. The heavy, automated glass doors of the terminal slid silently open, and Barbara confidently walked into the private luxury lobby. She was an absolute pristine vision of unyielding, wealthy arrogance. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, cream-colored cashmere wrap coat, a vibrant silk designer scarf draped elegantly over her narrow shoulders, and large, dark, oversized sunglasses, despite the incredibly gloomy Seattle weather. A uniformed terminal concierge trailed nervously and obediently behind her, actively pushing a polished brass luggage cart, completely loaded with pristine matching Louis Vuitton suitcases. She moved across the marble floor with the incredibly confident, practiced glide of a woman who genuinely believed she was utterly invincible and entirely untouchable by the normal rules of society. She was purposefully walking toward a private chartered jet that she thought would carry her directly to Miami, where her former lover, Marcus Sterling, was eagerly waiting in a $5 million waterfront mansion paid for entirely by her massive multi-million-dollar corporate theft. She genuinely thought she had completely destroyed my marriage, actively framed my innocent husband for severe federal wire fraud, and permanently secured her own luxurious, unbothered freedom. She purposefully approached the frosted glass doors of the VIP lounge, completely expecting to find a polite, smiling attendant offering her premium chilled champagne and warm-scented towels before her long, relaxing flight. Instead, the heavy double doors slid open to instantly reveal her absolute worst, most agonizing nightmare. Barbara stopped dead in her tracks, perfectly framed in the wide doorway like a deer caught in high beams. Her confident, arrogant smirk instantly vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated, visceral shock. She rapidly looked at Richard standing by the window like a furious, unyielding stone statue. She looked down at Liam sitting broken and completely devastated on the plush leather couch, refusing to even meet her eyes. She frantically looked at the aggressive corporate lawyers clutching their briefcases and the highly stoic federal agents reaching slowly for their official badges. And finally, her dark, terrified, predatory eyes locked directly and completely onto me, standing tall and entirely unbroken at the back of the room. For one incredibly long, agonizing second, the absolute silence in the private VIP lounge was so incredibly thick and heavy it felt physically suffocating. The only sound in the entire room was the aggressive rain violently lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Barbara rapidly blinked her wide eyes, trying desperately to cognitively process the horrifying, inescapable reality of the room. Her deeply ingrained sociopathic survival instincts instantly violently flared to life, and she immediately attempted to weaponize her lifelong practiced narrative of absolute total victimhood. She aggressively pushed her dark, expensive sunglasses up onto her perfectly styled blonde hair, her face rapidly contorting into a highly dramatic mask of furious, self-righteous indignation. She loudly demanded to know exactly what on earth was going on in this room. She looked directly at Richard, her voice artificially trembling with heavily manufactured betrayal, loudly asking him why he was cruelly ambushing her at the airport, when she was simply taking a desperate weekend trip to clear her fragile head from all the malicious, vicious lies I had been relentlessly spreading. Richard did not say a single verbal word. He did not yell or scream or curse her name. He simply stared at her with a look of such profound, absolute, devastating disgust that Barbara actually took a physical, involuntary step backward toward the exit. Realizing completely that Richard was entirely permanently immune to her toxic practice manipulation, she violently pivoted her entire frantic attention completely onto Liam. She aggressively rushed toward the leather sofa, her expensive heels clicking loudly on the marble border, her voice cracking with incredibly convincing manufactured motherly desperation. She loudly cried out to her son, claiming that he desperately needed to protect her from this absolute targeted corporate insanity. She forcefully pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face, her voice echoing loudly off the polished wall, screaming that I was a toxic, calculating, manipulative gold digger who had maliciously orchestrated this entire horrifying setup just to permanently, violently tear their beautiful, wealthy family apart. She aggressively yelled that I had manually manipulated the financial accounting records, that I had systematically brainwashed Richard into hating her, and that I was actively trying to completely destroy the innocent woman who had selflessly given Liam life. She desperately, wildly claimed that every single difficult thing she had ever done in her entire adult life was entirely for his ultimate benefit to permanently protect his wealthy future from common, pathetic, working-class opportunists, exactly like me. Liam slowly looked up at the woman who had actively lied to him every single day for 33 years. He did not yell back. He did not cry a single tear. He simply looked at her with exhausted, empty eyes that were utterly, completely devoid of any remaining familial affection. He quietly told his mother in a completely dead, emotionless voice that she was the absolute worst thing that had ever happened to him in his entire life, and that he knew absolutely everything about Marcus Sterling, the secret Cayman Islands routing numbers, and the massive $5 million fraudulent wire transfer. Barbara's heavily moisturized face rapidly drained of all remaining human color, completely transforming into a stark, terrifying shade of pale, ashen chalk. Her jaw went completely slack, her mouth hanging slightly open as her carefully constructed, wealthy, untouchable facade violently and completely shattered into a million jagged, irreparable pieces right in front of our eyes. She wildly, frantically looked toward the open glass door, desperately realizing there was absolutely no physical escape route. The three highly trained federal agents simultaneously took a single coordinated heavy step forward, their physical presence incredibly imposing and entirely undeniably lethal. This was the exact precise moment I had been vividly visualizing for 72 agonizing, totally sleepless hours. This was the absolute moment of pure, unadulterated, systemic justice. I slowly, deliberately stepped forward from the back of the room, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing exactly less than 3 feet away from her frozen, trembling frame. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not show a single microscopic ounce of angry emotion. I was completely, utterly, perfectly composed, entirely embodying the exact cold corporate professionalism she had always viciously mocked. I calmly reached into my tailored navy suit jacket and slowly withdrew my black smartphone. I seamlessly navigated to the highly encrypted audio file Jasmine and I had successfully secured just a few days ago in my home office. I firmly pressed play and held the speaker up high in the incredibly quiet, tense room. The pristine digital audio was painfully and undeniably clear. Every single person in that VIP lounge, including the federal agents, vividly heard Barbara's own vicious, highly arrogant voice explicitly threatening to publicly frame Liam, her own biological son, for the massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme if I did not immediately and permanently delete the Florida corporate ledger files. We all stood in absolute heavy silence, actively listening to her coldly declare that survival required difficult, brutal choices, and that she was perfectly willing to intentionally send her own son directly to federal prison just so she could comfortably retain her stolen offshore wealth. When the audio recording finally clicked off, the silence that followed was incredibly heavy and absolutely, utterly lethal. Barbara was physically, violently shaking, actively trembling inside her expensive cashmere coat, utterly unable to formulate a single coherent defensive thought or manipulative lie. I slowly reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, stapled legal document, heavily stamped with official red Federal Department of Justice seals. It was the absolute, undeniable paper proof of her terminal, catastrophic failure. I firmly handed her the emergency federal injunction, officially permanently freezing the $5 million wire transfer and completely seizing every single stolen penny currently sitting in the Cayman Islands accounts. She stared blindly down at the complex legal paperwork, her manicured hands shaking so incredibly badly that the heavy pages loudly audibly rustled in the quiet room. I looked her directly in her deeply terrified, panicked eyes, making absolutely certain she completely understood the sheer staggering magnitude of her spectacular total defeat. I looked at the woman who had tried to throw me away like common garbage, and I told her with a voice entirely made of pure, solid ice that she did not just simply fail to ruin my marriage. I told her that she had actively, meticulously, completely funded her own federal indictment. The lead federal agent smoothly, purposefully stepped forward, completely breaking the tense, heavy silence, firmly instructing Barbara to slowly place her hands behind her back. As the heavy cold steel handcuffs loudly aggressively clicked securely shut around her expensive soft wrists, completely locking her into a horrifying new permanent reality, I watched the absolute terror finally utterly consume her. The wealthy, untouchable, vicious matriarch of the family was completely permanently gone, successfully replaced by a broken, terrified criminal who was about to spend the rest of her miserable life locked away in a cold concrete federal cell, while my husband and I finally walked away entirely permanently and beautifully free. The heavy cold steel handcuffs completely shattered the quiet luxury of the private aviation terminal, clicking shut with a loud, sharp finality that echoed off the polished glass walls. I watched with absolute unblinking satisfaction as the federal agents firmly guided Barbara away from her pile of pristine designer luggage and directed her toward the main public exit. She was no longer the untouchable, arrogant matriarch of Seattle high society. She was just another desperate, terrified criminal caught completely red-handed in the undeniable act of massive corporate theft. As they walked her forcefully through the crowded main concourse, her incredibly expensive cream-colored cashmere coat slipped carelessly off her shoulder, dragging pitifully on the polished marble floor. Dozens of wealthy seasoned travelers, high-powered corporate executives, and elite country club acquaintances stopped dead in their tracks, turning to stare at her in absolute visceral shock. The hushed, panicked whispers started immediately spreading like a vicious, uncontrollable wildfire through the busy terminal. Her pristine, carefully manufactured social reputation dissolved into absolute toxic ash right there in front of the departure gates. There was absolutely no elegant, expensive public relations spin she could possibly put on this horrifying spectacle. There were no fake manufactured tears that could ever save her from the cold, hard, unyielding reality of federal wire fraud and massive grand larceny. She was utterly, completely, and spectacularly ruined. The federal authorities did not waste a single second of their highly coordinated strike, because Jasmine and I had provided them with an entirely flawless, meticulously documented forensic roadmap. They moved with terrifying absolute speed and overwhelming precision. While Barbara was sitting in a cold, sterile federal interrogation room, desperately demanding her expensive defense lawyers, the FBI was actively executing a massive, heavily armed raid 3,000 miles away in the warm Florida sunshine. Federal agents physically broke down the heavy custom mahogany doors of Marcus Sterling's luxurious $5 million waterfront mansion in Miami. He was forcefully pulled out of his incredibly expensive imported silk sheets and thrown violently onto the cold marble floor by heavily armed tactical units. Every single tangible asset Barbara had illegally purchased for him over the last 12 years using Richard's stolen corporate funds was instantly and violently seized. The massive luxury yachts, the highly secure offshore bank accounts, the heavily padded dummy shell companies, they were all immediately completely frozen and entirely confiscated by the Department of Justice. Marcus was a pathetic, arrogant coward who had happily and greedily lived off stolen corporate money for over a decade, but the absolute second he directly faced the horrifying prospect of spending 20 years in a maximum security federal prison, he instantly violently turned on Barbara. He eagerly provided the federal prosecutors with every single private encrypted email, every recorded phone call, and every filthy, dirty secret they had shared over the past 12 years, completely sealing her permanent fate in exchange for a highly reduced criminal sentence. Barbara's incredibly expensive, ruthless defense attorneys aggressively attempted to secure her immediate release on bail. They confidently marched into the austere federal courthouse, loudly demanding that she be allowed to return to the massive suburban mansion pending her official trial. But the federal judge took one single look at the overwhelming mountain of irrefutable digital evidence Jasmine and I had meticulously compiled. The judge looked at the frozen $5 million offshore wire transfer, the explicitly forged biometric executive signatures, and the raw, undeniable audio recording of her threatening to maliciously frame her own innocent son. The judge officially declared Barbara a severe immediate flight risk and a distinct danger to the ongoing financial investigation. She was completely, utterly denied bail. She was forcefully stripped of her expensive designer silk dresses and forced to wear a highly unflattering, scratchy orange federal jumpsuit. The incredibly arrogant woman, who had spent 33 years violently judging absolutely everyone around her for not being wealthy enough or elite enough, was now permanently locked inside a tiny, cold concrete cell with absolutely nothing but her own massive, suffocating regrets. She entirely lost the massive, beautiful estate. She completely lost her stolen multi-million-dollar fortune. She utterly lost her entirely fake high society standing, and she completely, permanently lost her freedom. No one from her elite restricted country club ever called her. No one from her prestigious charity boards ever wrote a single letter to her. She was entirely, completely erased from the wealthy, luxurious world she had so ruthlessly worshipped. 3 agonizingly long weeks after the spectacular federal takedown, the chaotic legal dust finally began to completely settle. Richard called Liam and me early on a Tuesday morning and quietly asked us to meet him directly at his corporate headquarters. Walking back into that massive towering glass and steel building felt completely, entirely different this time. The crushing heavy anxiety and the terrifying ticking clock were entirely gone, completely replaced by a calm, unbreakable sense of absolute profound peace. When we walked into Richard's massive corner office, he was not standing aggressively by the large window or barking furious, impatient orders at his terrified staff. He was sitting very quietly at his large mahogany desk, looking incredibly thoughtful, deeply weathered, and profoundly humbled. He stood up slowly as we entered and gestured for us to sit in the heavy leather guest chairs across from him. He looked directly at me, his dark, intense eyes completely, entirely stripped of the harsh, arrogant judgment he had actively carried for the past 5 agonizing years. He folded his large hands together on top of the polished desk, and he took a very slow, incredibly deep breath. He told me with a raw, uncharacteristically thick voice that for 5 long years, he had been an incredibly blind, arrogant, and foolish man. He said he had looked at me sitting at family dinners and only saw a simple working-class payroll clerk, a basic spreadsheet girl who did not fundamentally belong in his elite, highly sophisticated world. He specifically used the exact insulting phrase his toxic wife had repeatedly weaponized against me, but he used it with profound, heavy, agonizing shame. He looked me right in the eye, and he sincerely, officially, and deeply apologized. He admitted with total, absolute clarity that the common spreadsheet girl he had actively, maliciously looked down upon was the absolute only person intelligent enough, loyal enough, and brave enough to completely save his entire life's work from absolute, total destruction. He said I had fiercely protected his massive legacy when he was entirely too blind and too arrogant to protect it himself. Hearing those incredibly rare words from a powerful man who had never genuinely apologized to anyone in his entire adult life was incredibly, profoundly validating. It was the absolute ultimate vindication of my dedicated career, my sharp intelligence, and my fierce, unwavering protective loyalty to my family. Richard then slowly turned his intense emotional gaze directly to Liam. My husband sat tall and completely steady. His broad shoulders finally relaxed, and his eyes incredibly clear after weeks of horrifying emotional trauma. Richard reached across the heavy desk and gently pushed a thick stack of official-bound legal documents directly toward us. He told Liam that the horrific events of the past few weeks had forced him to completely, violently reevaluate absolutely everything he thought he knew about family, about bloodlines, and about true loyalty. He stated firmly, with absolute unyielding conviction, that an accidental shared DNA sequence did not make a man a father, and basic biology did not magically make a boy a son. He said that Barbara had violently, maliciously betrayed them both in the worst possible ways, but that shared horrific trauma did not ever erase 33 beautiful years of incredibly deep shared history. Richard looked at Liam with a fierce, incredibly protective, fatherly love and told him that he was his true son, no matter what any sterile piece of medical paper ever claimed. He told Liam that absolute loyalty, unyielding integrity, and fierce protective honor were the true, actual defining characteristics of their family. He then officially announced that he had completely permanently restructured his entire massive corporate estate. He had entirely, legally, and completely disinherited Barbara, leaving her absolutely nothing but a mountain of crushing federal legal fees. He had officially permanently named Liam as the primary equal co-heir to his entire multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire alongside our bright young son David. Richard smiled a genuine, warm, tired smile and told me that he wanted to absolutely ensure that the incredibly brilliant, fiercely protective woman who had saved his entire company would always have absolute complete authority over its financial future. He permanently cemented the absolute undeniable truth that a real strong family is never simply built on generic genetics. Real family is actively, intentionally built on fierce, unwavering loyalty, mutual, profound respect, and the incredibly brave, dedicated people who absolutely refuse to walk away when the heavy, terrifying storms finally hit. Looking back at the absolute chaotic nightmare of everything that happened, I do not regret a single difficult, agonizing, sleepless night. I do not regret the sheer mind-numbing terror of that massive forensic audit or the explosive, devastating confrontation in the private airport lounge. I learned a profound, incredible lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my entire life. I learned that you cannot ever allow toxic, incredibly manipulative people to dictate your personal self-worth simply because they have more money or a highly elevated social status. You have to actively, firmly, and fiercely stand up for the innocent people you love. You have to quickly draw a hard, unyielding boundary and absolutely refuse to let arrogant predators walk all over your peaceful life. Barbara genuinely thought my modest background and my quiet demeanor made me an incredibly easy disposable target. She completely, utterly underestimated the lethal, terrifying power of a devoted mother and a highly loyal wife who knows exactly how to meticulously read a complex general ledger. If you are watching this video right now, and you are dealing with a highly toxic, difficult family member who constantly, repeatedly makes you feel small, invisible, or entirely unworthy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do absolutely not have to accept their cruel, relentless manipulation. You have incredible, inherent, beautiful power. You have the absolute right to demand basic human respect, and you have the magnificent strength to actively, beautifully rewrite your own story completely on your own terms. Do not ever let anyone convince you that you are just a minor background character in their wealthy, arrogant, dramatic play. You are the absolute strong hero of your own beautiful life. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredibly intense, difficult, and ultimately highly victorious story. If this journey resonated deeply with your own personal experiences, please hit that like button and absolutely subscribe to the channel right now. Your incredible support truly means the absolute world to me, and it helps these important, crucial stories reach the exact people who desperately, desperately need to hear them today. I want to connect with you directly in the comments below. Tell me exactly where you are watching this video from right now, and tell me exactly what time it is there. I read every single one of your incredible supportive comments. Until next time, please take care of yourself perfectly. Guard your own personal boundaries and always completely remember your true, absolute, undeniable worth. 6 months have passed since that stormy Friday afternoon at the private aviation terminal. It is truly amazing how quickly the air clears when you finally remove the absolute source of the toxic pollution. Our home feels entirely different now. It is lighter and infinitely warmer. The constant heavy anxiety that used to tightly grip my chest every single time my phone rang has completely permanently vanished. Liam and I are stronger and more deeply connected than we have ever been in our entire lives. The horrific trauma of discovering his mother's true sociopathic nature and the devastating revelation about his biological father could have easily entirely destroyed a weaker man. But Liam did not break. He chose to actively lean into the incredibly fierce, unconditional love we built together. He stepped up beautifully, completely embracing his new official role as co-heir to the company alongside David. He and Richard have actually forged a remarkably profound, authentic relationship. It is not built on fear or impossible, arrogant expectations, but on mutual survival, absolute respect, and the undeniable shared reality that family is a choice you make every single day. And then there is our beautiful sweet son Leo. I sit on the porch with a warm cup of coffee, watching him happily run through the green grass, chasing butterflies in the afternoon sun. He's completely, wonderfully thriving. He is entirely oblivious to the massive, terrifying storm that he inadvertently started simply by needing a routine medical test. He will never ever know the absolute vicious cruelty of the woman who shared his genetics, but severely lacked his beautiful humanity. He will grow up in a home strictly defined by absolute honesty, fierce protection, and unconditional, unwavering love. We successfully shielded his precious innocence, and looking at his bright, joyful smile, I know that every single agonizing, sleepless night was absolutely incredibly worth it. Last night, Jasmine and I went out for a quiet, incredibly well-deserved dinner to celebrate. We did not choose a loud, crowded restaurant or a highly pretentious country club. We chose a small, cozy Italian place tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. We ordered a beautifully rich bottle of red wine, and we finally allowed ourselves to completely exhale. We toasted to the sheer undeniable power of forensic accounting. We toasted to the absolute lethal precision of women who follow the money. Jasmine has been officially promoted at work, her brilliant compliance skills highly recognized and handsomely rewarded. We sat there, laughing quietly, reflecting on those 72 hours we spent locked in my home office, fueled entirely by black coffee and righteous, terrifying fury. We had actively taken down an untouchable high society predator using nothing but glowing spreadsheets, complex digital routing numbers, and absolute relentless determination. There is an incredibly profound permanent bond that forms between two women when you actively go to war together and emerge entirely, completely victorious. We did not just simply expose a crime, we completely, entirely dismantled an abusive empire. We forced the absolute truth out into the blinding light of day, and we watched the heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary loudly, permanently close on the woman who tried to destroy us. Looking back on the absolute chaos of the last 5 years, I realize I learned the most difficult, incredibly painful lesson of my entire adult life. I spent 5 long, exhausting years letting a woman actively, repeatedly make me feel incredibly small because I genuinely deeply thought keeping the peace was exactly what a good, devoted wife did. I silently absorbed her cruel, pointed insults. I quietly tolerated her malicious, degrading comments about my modest background. I foolishly believed that if I just remained agreeable and quiet and absolutely invisible, I could somehow magically protect Liam from the painful, toxic reality of his own mother. But I was incredibly, dangerously wrong. Keeping the peace with a monster just actively makes you their absolute next meal. Predators do not ever respect your silence. They simply view your quiet endurance as an open, explicit invitation to completely consume you. When Barbara aggressively decided to orchestrate a fake DNA test to utterly ruin my marriage, and when she viciously planned to frame her own innocent son for massive federal wire fraud, she forced me to finally violently wake up. I finally clearly understood that setting firm, unyielding boundaries is absolutely not a betrayal of your family. Boundaries are the absolute ultimate fierce protection of it. You cannot ever save a highly toxic person by allowing them to actively trample over your dignity. You save your actual innocent loved ones by standing up firmly, planting your feet completely into the ground, and absolutely refusing to let the wicked arrogance of an abuser dictate your beautiful, peaceful reality. I am incredibly proud of the woman I am today. I am no longer the quiet, disposable spreadsheet girl. I am the fierce, absolutely immovable protector of my family. If you have ever been targeted by a highly toxic in-law who arrogantly thought they were significantly smarter than you, I desperately want to hear your specific story. Please take just a brief moment to drop a highly detailed comment down below right now and let me know exactly where you are watching this video from today and exactly what time it currently is there. If you deeply, truly believe in the absolute undeniable power of beautiful, poetic karma and actively taking your own personal power back, please hit that incredibly important like button right now and quickly subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories, exactly like this one. Your amazing continuous support means the absolute entire world to me, and it truly helps this wonderful community grow beautifully. Until next time, please always safely remember this one incredibly crucial defining fact. The absolute truth always permanently, completely comes to light. And sometimes it completely, beautifully, brilliantly burns the vicious toxic liar entirely down to the absolute solid ground forever.